Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel. And leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. The heat in Nevada can make you do stupid things. And maybe that's my excuse for ignoring every warning I got that Saturday in early September. I'd been driving through the desert for weeks, documenting ghost towns for my dissertation on economic collapse in mining communities. And honestly, after visiting 12 settlements that were nothing but foundation stones and rusty nails, I was getting desperate for something substantial. The old-timer at the gas station in Searchlight kept wiping the same spot on the counter while he talked, his eyes never quite meeting mine, telling me about this place 40 miles northwest that nobody visits anymore. Not since the flooding in the mine back in '78, he said. Not since those families disappeared. But I needed this. My advisor had already rejected 2 thesis proposals, and turning 31 while still chasing a PhD was starting to feel like running in quicksand. The road out there wasn't on any map I had, just a dirt track that branched off the highway near mile marker 47, exactly where the gas station owner said it would be. My Subaru kicked up dust clouds that hung in the rearview mirror like ghosts, and after 20 minutes of washboard roads that rattled my teeth, I saw the first structures rising from the desert floor. There were maybe 15 buildings still standing, their wood bleached white as bones, windows nothing but dark squares that seemed to watch my approach. I parked near what looked like the old general store, its sign hanging by one chain, creaking in the wind even though I couldn't feel any breeze. The silence hit me first, not peaceful quiet, but the kind that makes your ears ring, like the desert itself was holding its breath. I grabbed my camera and notebook, telling myself the unease crawling up my spine was just excitement about finally finding an intact site. The first thing that didn't make sense was the footprints. Fresh ones, maybe a day old at most, leading from behind the general store toward a cluster of collapsed shacks near the mine entrance. I followed them, my boots crunching on the hard-packed dirt, and that's when I noticed the trailer. It sat between 2 fallen buildings like someone had deliberately hidden it there. Aluminum siding still shiny under layers of dust. Definitely not from the mining era. A heavy padlock secured the door, the kind you'd buy at Home Depot. Not some antique rusted thing. I was photographing it when I heard the music, faint, tinny, like an old radio playing from somewhere inside. My hand hesitated on the door handle, and I pressed my ear against the warm metal. Definitely music. Some country song I didn't recognize, barely audible, but unmistakably there. I should have left right then. Should have driven straight back to Searchlight and deleted the photos, forgotten the whole place existed. But I kept thinking about my thesis, about the rejection letters, about spending another year waiting tables while my college friends were buying houses and having kids. So I walked deeper into the settlement, documenting everything with my camera, taking notes on the unusual preservation of certain structures. The sun was getting lower, painting long shadows across the desert floor, and I found myself at the mine entrance, a gaping mouth in the hillside, reinforced with timber that looked surprisingly solid. More footprints led inside, lots of them, different shoe sizes, some going in, some coming out. The air flowing from the mine felt cooler, carrying a smell like motor oil and something else, something organic that made me step back instinctively. That's when I saw the generator. It was tucked behind a pile of rotting lumber near the mine entrance, a yellow Caterpillar model, industrial-sized with fresh fuel cans stacked beside it. The thing wasn't running, but when I touched the engine block, warmth still radiated from the metal. Someone had used it recently, maybe within the last few hours. My phone showed 5:47 p.m., and I realized I'd been there longer than planned, the desert already turning that deep orange that comes before dark. I started walking back toward my car, faster now, when I noticed something else that made me stop cold. Tire tracks, fresh ones, multiple sets, crisscrossing the main path through town. They hadn't been there when I arrived. I was sure of it because I'd specifically photographed that area for its undisturbed sand patterns. The logical part of my brain tried to explain it away. Maybe locals used this place for parties, or perhaps someone was salvaging metal from the ruins. But those explanations crumbled when I reached my car and found a folded piece of paper tucked under the windshield wiper. My fingers trembled as I unfolded it, expecting maybe a warning from local teenagers or a note from another researcher. Instead, there was a single line written in pencil. You need to leave before they count the inventory. No signature, nothing else. Just those 8 words that made absolutely no sense but somehow felt like the most important message I'd ever received. I looked around the empty settlement, at the shadows growing longer between buildings, and for the first time, noticed how many corners and doorways could hide someone watching. I threw my gear in the back seat and fumbled for my keys, every instinct screaming at me to get out now. The engine turned over on the 3rd try and I was reversing when I saw them. 3 sets of headlights in the distance, maybe 2 miles out, bouncing along the access road toward the settlement. They were moving fast, too fast for casual visitors or lost tourists, and they were definitely coming this way. There was nowhere else that road led. I slammed the car into drive and headed for the exit, but as I passed the trailer with the music, the door was open. Wide open, padlock hanging loose, and I could see inside for just a second as my headlights swept past. Rows of shelving, like a pharmacy, filled with labeled containers, and in the back, several people sitting very still on benches, their faces turned away from the light. My Subaru fishtailed as I hit the dirt road too fast, dust clouding everything behind me. Those headlights were gaining, eating up the distance between us like they knew exactly where I was going. I called my roommate, needed to tell someone where I was in case. The call connected and I started talking fast, giving her the location, describing the turnoff at mile marker 47, but the signal cut out mid-sentence just as I was explaining about the trailer. No bars, no service, nothing. The phone was completely dead even though I'd charged it that morning. In the rearview mirror, the headlights had spread out, one staying behind me while the other 2 disappeared onto parallel paths I hadn't even known existed. They were trying to box me in, and I realized with perfect, terrifying clarity that they knew this desert better than I ever would. The main road was still 10 minutes away, but suddenly there were headlights in front of me too, coming from a side trail that materialized out of the darkness. I yanked the wheel hard left, leaving the road entirely, praying the Subaru could handle the raw desert terrain. The car bucked and pitched over rocks and scrub brush, my teeth clacking together with each impact, the steering wheel trying to tear itself from my grip. Behind me, 2 of the vehicles followed while the 3rd stayed on the road, probably waiting for me to circle back. These weren't random locals or scavengers. They moved with coordination, purpose, like they'd done this before. My headlights caught a flash of an old wooden sign barely visible in the sagebrush. Grayson Mine Shaft 3. Danger, keep out. Without thinking, I drove straight toward it, hoping maybe the old mining roads would give me an advantage. The shaft entrance loomed in my headlights, a timber-framed hole cut into a low hill, and I saw my only chance. There was a dirt path running alongside it, probably an old maintenance road, narrow but passable. I killed my headlights and engine simultaneously, letting momentum carry me into the deeper shadows beside the mine entrance. The Subaru rolled to a stop behind a pile of rusted mining equipment, and I held my breath, watching through the rear window as the pursuing headlights swept past, then stopped, then started backing up. They'd lost me for a moment, but not for long. I could hear doors slamming, voices calling out to each other in the darkness, organized and calm like they were conducting a routine search. One of them had a flashlight, one of those powerful spotlights that turned night into day, and it was sweeping methodically through the area where I'd left the road. That's when I made the decision that probably saved my life. Instead of staying with the car, I grabbed my backpack and slipped out the passenger door, staying low, moving toward the mine entrance. The shaft went back about 30 feet before hitting a collapse, but there was a side passage, partially hidden behind fallen timbers. I squeezed through, the space so tight my shoulders scraped both walls, and found myself in a slightly wider chamber. Old tools hung on the walls, pickaxes, shovels, things that hadn't been touched in decades. and there was another narrow passage leading deeper. I could hear them outside getting closer, one voice saying they found fresh tire tracks leading toward the mine. The spotlight beam swept across the entrance, and I pressed myself deeper into the passage, feeling my way in complete darkness, my breathing so loud I was sure they'd hear it echoing off the stone walls. I stayed in that mine for 6 hours, moving deeper whenever I heard them getting close, navigating by touch through passages that seemed to connect in a maze of tunnels. Around midnight, the sounds finally stopped, but I waited another 2 hours before creeping back toward the entrance. My car was gone. Not a trace of it anywhere, like it had never existed. I had to walk 8 miles through the desert to reach the highway, hiding whenever headlights appeared, finally flagging down a truck driver at dawn who took me back to Searchlight. When I reported everything to the police, they found my Subaru 3 days later, hidden under a brown tarp in one of the mine shafts 2 miles from where I'd abandoned it. The engine was still warm, they said, even though it had been missing for days. The trailer was gone, the footprints were gone, even the generator had vanished. The only thing they found was my camera sitting on the driver's seat, all the photos deleted except one, a picture I didn't take, showing the inside of that trailer, rows and rows of people sitting on benches, all of them looking directly at the camera with the same empty expression. The Mojave stretched out in front of me like an endless ocean of dust and Joshua trees, and I remember thinking how perfect the light was that October morning. I'd been chasing desert kit foxes for 3 weeks straight, sleeping in my truck and living off granola bars and bottled water. The kind of solitary work that made my editor at National Geographic question my sanity every time we talked on the satellite phone. My divorce had finalized 6 months earlier, right after my 37th birthday, and throwing myself into documenting endangered species seemed healthier than sitting in my empty apartment in Phoenix. The assignment was simple enough: capture behavioral footage of the foxes during their breeding season, something that hadn't been properly documented in over a decade. I'd already gotten some decent shots near Kelso Dunes, but I wanted something special, something that would make the magazine's front cover and remind everyone why I used to win awards before my life fell apart. I turned off the main highway about an hour earlier, following a Forest Service map that promised an old mining road leading to untouched habitat. The dirt track was rougher than expected, full of washouts from last winter's flash floods, and my pickup crawled along at maybe 10 miles per hour while dust devils danced across the barren landscape. That's when I spotted the van, maybe a quarter mile ahead, parked sideways across the narrow road like someone had tried to turn around but gave up halfway through. Both doors hung open like broken wings, and even from a distance I could see camping gear scattered on the ground. A blue sleeping bag unrolled in the dirt, a Coleman stove tipped on its side, plastic water bottles reflecting the morning sun. My first thought was some city folks had gotten lost, maybe ran out of gas or got spooked by the isolation, because you'd be amazed how many people underestimate the desert and end up needing rescue. I pulled up about 20 feet behind the van and killed my engine, the sudden silence almost deafening after hours of driving. The vehicle was a white Ford Econoline, probably from the early 2000s, with Arizona plates covered in so much dust I had to squint to read the numbers. No sounds came from inside, no movement except for a piece of paper fluttering on the driver's seat, held down by what looked like a thermos. I called out a greeting, then another louder one, but my voice just disappeared into the vastness around us. The smart thing would have been to radio the situation in and keep driving, but the scattered gear bothered me in a way I couldn't quite explain. Everything looked too deliberate, too organized despite the chaos, like someone had carefully arranged their belongings before walking away. The sleeping bag wasn't just dropped, but unrolled perfectly straight, the water bottles lined up in a row beside it, and when I walked closer, I noticed a digital camera on a tripod pointing toward the horizon, its red recording light still blinking steadily. The inside of the van hit me with a wave of stale air, and something else, something metallic and wrong that made me breathe through my mouth. The front seats were covered in manila folders, loose papers, and what looked like printouts from missing persons websites. Faces of young women and men staring up at me with hopeful smiles from happier times. But it was the document on the driver's seat that stopped me cold. A half-completed police report form from the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department, dated just 3 days ago. The officer's name at the top read, Deputy James Holbrook, badge number 4827, and the incident type was listed as Suspicious Activity Investigation. Most of the form was blank, but under the preliminary notes section, someone had written in shaky handwriting, multiple subjects confirmed at coordinates, appears to be underground storage, requesting immediate backup before proceeding. Below that, a topographical map of the area was spread out, marked with red X's at various points, and a dark brown stain that looked disturbingly like dried blood had soaked through one corner, obscuring part of the legend. My satellite phone was back in the truck, and every instinct told me to grab it and call for help immediately. But those red marks on the map, they weren't random. One of them matched exactly where I was standing, and another marked a spot about 2 miles north, near what the map labeled as Coyote Dry Lake. The bloodstain covered a third mark, but I could make out enough to see it was near an abandoned borax mine I'd passed yesterday. What really made my pulse quicken were the photographs paper-clipped to the folders. Surveillance-style shots of different vehicles parked at gas stations, rest stops, and campgrounds throughout the region. Each photo had a date and timestamp in the corner, some going back months, and I recognized a few of the locations from my own travels through the area. One folder was labeled Pattern Analysis in neat handwriting, completely different from the shaky scrawl on the police report, and inside were charts tracking disappearances by date, location, and victim profile, all centered around a 50-mile radius of where I now stood. The rationalization started immediately, that comforting voice in your head that tries to explain away the obvious horror. Maybe Holbrook was an off-duty cop doing his own investigation. Maybe he was a private investigator hired by desperate families. Maybe the blood was from a nosebleed or a cut hand. But then I found the deputy's badge under the passenger seat, along with his service weapon, a Glock 22 with a full magazine. And nobody, absolutely nobody in law enforcement leaves those things behind voluntarily. The radio mounted on the dashboard was smashed, wires hanging loose like exposed nerves. And when I looked closer at the driver's seat, I could see fingernail marks gouged deep into the fabric, as if someone had been dragged out while fighting to stay inside. The keys were still in the ignition, the engine cold but the battery still working, which meant the van hadn't been here more than a day or two at most. Through the back windows, I could see more equipment, zip ties, rope, a shovel, heavy-duty trash bags, and a handheld GPS unit still showing the last searched coordinates, which pointed directly to the dry lake bed marked on the bloody map. I should have left right then, should have driven straight back to civilization and let the authorities handle whatever nightmare was unfolding in this forgotten corner of the desert. But those faces in the missing persons reports kept staring at me, and one of them, a young woman named Kayla Brennan from Flagstaff, had disappeared just last week according to the printout. Her parents were offering a $50,000 reward, and in her photo she wore a turquoise necklace, identical to one I'd seen glinting in the dirt near the van's rear tire. The GPS coordinates on that handheld unit were only 2 miles away, and if there was even a chance someone was still alive out there, if Deputy Holbrook had found something before whatever happened to him, then I couldn't just drive away. I grabbed the Glock, checking the chamber and safety like my ex-military brother had taught me years ago, tucked the GPS unit in my pocket along with my satellite phone, and started walking north toward the coordinates, telling myself I'd just look from a distance, just confirm what was there before calling for help. The desert heat was already climbing toward unbearable as I followed a narrow wash that led toward the dry lake, my photographer's eye automatically noting how the morning shadows played across the ancient rocks and scattered bones of long-dead animals. Every few hundred yards, I found more evidence that someone had been through here recently. Fresh boot prints in the sandy patches, a crushed energy drink can that hadn't been there long enough to fade in the sun, and strangest of all, small fluorescent orange flags stuck in the ground at regular intervals, like someone was marking a trail. The GPS showed I was getting closer to the coordinates, and through my telephoto lens, I could make out what looked like a cluster of old shipping containers near the edge of the lake bed, their rust-colored surfaces almost invisible against the surrounding rocks. But it was the smell that hit me first, carried on the light breeze, a sweet, sick odor that anyone who's spent time in war zones or disaster areas recognizes immediately. Death has a very particular scent in the desert, where the dry air mummifies rather than decomposes, and this wasn't the smell of one body, but several, mixed with something chemical and sharp that burned the inside of my nostrils. The shipping containers were arranged in a rough semicircle, partially buried in the alkali soil of the dried lake, and someone had welded them together with steel plates to create one continuous structure. Heavy chains and industrial padlocks secured the doors, but one container at the far end stood open, its entrance a black rectangle that seemed to swallow the morning light. Fresh tire tracks led right up to it, multiple sets overlapping, and scattered around were more personal items. A woman's sneaker, a baseball cap with a University of Arizona logo, a wallet splayed open in the dirt with credit cards spilling out. I recognized Deputy Holbrook's handwriting on a notepad near the entrance, pages flapping in the wind, documenting license plate numbers, dates, and what looked like delivery schedules for something called Project Coyote. The last entry, written in increasingly erratic script, simply read, "They know I'm here, can hear the trucks coming back. If anyone finds this, the main site is 5 miles northeast, Old Garrison Mine. They've been using it since 2018. At least 30 missing. Still alive underground. Tell my wife." The sentence ended mid-word, the pen mark dragging off the page in a long, desperate line. I stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds, the weight of the Glock suddenly feeling inadequate against whatever operation was happening here. Through the open container door, I could see industrial shelving stocked with medical supplies, IV bags, restraints, and dozens of those blue pharmaceutical coolers that hospitals use for organ transport. A generator hummed somewhere inside, keeping refrigeration units running, and a work table near the entrance held surgical instruments laid out on sterile cloth, recently used and waiting to be cleaned. The realization of what this place was, what someone was doing out here in the middle of nowhere, hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't just murder or kidnapping. This was something systematically worse, something that required infrastructure and planning and multiple people working together. The sound of an engine in the distance snapped me back to immediate danger, dust rising maybe 2 miles away and heading directly toward the containers, moving fast across the desert floor in a way that suggested whoever was driving knew exactly where they were going. Running back through the desert felt like one of those nightmares where your legs won't work properly, the soft sand grabbing at my boots while the sound of engines grew louder behind me. I made it to my truck and immediately called 911 on the satellite phone, but the connection was terrible, cutting in and out as I tried to explain what I'd found. The dispatcher kept asking me to repeat my location, and I was screaming the GPS coordinates when I saw 2 vehicles crest a ridge behind me, modified pickup trucks with reinforced bumpers and tinted windows. I threw the truck in drive and floored it, the rear wheels spinning before catching traction, and started the most terrifying drive of my life back toward the main highway. They followed for about 10 miles, staying just close enough to let me know they were there before suddenly stopping at what must have been some predetermined boundary. I didn't stop driving until I reached a highway patrol station in Barstow, where I spent the next 6 hours giving statements, looking at photos, and watching the disbelief on officers' faces slowly turn to alarm as they verified parts of my story. The raid on the containers happened that night, a joint operation between FBI, ATF, and local law enforcement that made national news for about 3 days before being buried under other headlines. They found the remains of 14 people in various states of decomposition, the underground facility at Garrison Mine that Holbrook had mentioned, and enough evidence to arrest 7 individuals connected to what investigators called a medical trafficking ring. But here's what still keeps me awake at night. They never found Deputy James Holbrook, dead or alive, and 23 people from those missing persons files remain unaccounted for. The prosecutor said the ring had been operating for at least 6 years, targeting travelers and drifters, people whose disappearances wouldn't immediately raise alarms. I testified at the trial, showed my photographs, and watched as 3 doctors, 2 EMTs, and 2 men identified only as logistics coordinators received life sentences. But during the trial, one of the defendants smiled at me from across the courtroom and mouthed the words, "There are others," and I knew he wasn't lying. I still photograph wildlife, but I don't work alone in remote areas anymore. And every time I see an abandoned vehicle on a desert road, I keep driving and call it in from a safe distance, because some things in the desert are meant to stay hidden, and some horrors are all too human. Friday afternoon in early August changed everything about how I see the desert around Alamogordo. I run a small electronics repair shop downtown, and when Detective Vasquez walked through my door carrying a damaged phone in an evidence bag, I figured it would be just another data recovery job for the police department. He was a stocky guy with graying temples who explained they needed help accessing the contents of a phone belonging to a missing person. According to the report he placed on my counter, Natalie Dunn had just turned 26 in July, making her 2 years younger than me. She'd driven out here alone from Ohio to film content for her travel channel, one of those YouTube ventures where people document their solo adventures in remote places. Her parents had called the authorities after she failed to check in for 3 days straight, and search teams found her silver Subaru Outback abandoned on a dirt road about 15 miles from the main highway, locked from the inside with all her camping gear still packed neatly in the trunk. My fingers worked carefully around the spider-webbed glass as I connected the phone to my recovery equipment. When I finally bypassed the damaged screen and pulled up her GPS history, the data showed something that made both Detective Vasquez and me exchange worried glances. Her last recorded location was about 20 miles from where they found the car, deep inside what I immediately recognized as military-restricted territory near the missile range. The timestamp read 11:47 p.m. on the night she disappeared, and after that, absolute nothing. Just that single frozen coordinate pulsing on my monitor, like a digital beacon in the middle of nowhere. Detective Vasquez leaned closer, his coffee breath filling the space between us, and asked if I could recover any photos or videos from that day. Natalie had filmed everything, apparently planning to edit it all into a vlog episode about desert camping. And as the video files began loading one by one, we found ourselves watching them right there in my shop, instead of just transferring them to the evidence drive like we should have. Her first video that morning showed her standing beside her Subaru at a gas station, huge sunglasses reflecting the early sunshine while she held her camera at arm's length. She had this infectious energy, talking about how she'd been planning this trip for months, wanting to capture the real desert experience away from tourist spots. Natalie explained she'd researched lesser-known areas around White Sands, spots where she could get dramatic footage without crowds of people in the background. She showed her supplies: 5 gallons of water, enough food for 3 days, a satellite phone for emergencies, and a bright orange tent she joked would be visible from space. What struck me was how prepared she seemed, checking off items from a laminated list while narrating her safety protocols. She even mentioned telling her parents her exact route and that she'd check in every evening at 8. The detective paused the video to make notes, and I noticed his pen hovering when she mentioned she'd hired a local guide named Carson to show her some photography spots, though she planned to camp alone. Video number 2 started around noon with the camera mounted on her dashboard, capturing the endless stretch of desert highway while she sang along to some pop song I didn't recognize. She pulled over several times to film the landscape, each shot showing her getting more excited about the isolation and beauty of the area. At one point, she stood on a rock formation and slowly panned the camera in a complete circle, showing nothing but desert scrub and distant mountains in every direction. "This is exactly what I wanted," she said to the camera, her voice filled with genuine awe. No cell towers, no buildings, just pure wilderness. Around the fourth hour of driving footage, she met up with Carson at a crossroads. A lanky guy in his 40s wearing a weathered cowboy hat who pointed out various directions on her map, his finger tracing roads that weren't on any GPS. Detective Vasquez asked me to zoom in on the map, but the video quality made it impossible to read the markings clearly. After Carson left, Natalie continued alone, following what looked like a barely visible dirt track that wound between clusters of yucca plants and Joshua trees. By late afternoon in her videos, the landscape had transformed into something almost alien. She'd reached an area where the sand had this strange grayish-white color, and she kept stopping to film herself sifting it through her fingers, marveling at how fine it was compared to regular sand. The sun was getting lower, casting these long, dramatic shadows that she used for artistic shots of her footprints disappearing into the distance. Around 6 p.m., she found what she called the perfect spot, a flat area surrounded by low hills that would block the wind but still give her a view of the stars. She set up her orange tent with practiced efficiency, narrating each step for her future viewers, explaining how to properly stake down a tent in loose sand and why she'd chosen this particular model for desert camping. While she worked, she kept glancing at something behind the camera and at one point said, "That's weird, I didn't see those earlier." But the camera was facing her tent, so we couldn't see what she meant. Detective Vasquez rewound that part 3 times, and we both noticed how her cheerful demeanor had shifted slightly, though she quickly went back to her upbeat narration. Her sunset footage was genuinely beautiful, the desert bathed in gold and purple light while she cooked freeze-dried pasta on her portable stove. She'd positioned the camera on a tripod to film herself preparing dinner, talking about how peaceful everything was, how the silence was so complete she could hear her own heartbeat. But around 7:30 p.m., something changed in the videos. She kept turning to look behind her, and twice she stood up suddenly and walked out of frame for several minutes, leaving the camera running on an empty camp chair. When she came back the second time, she forced a laugh and said the desert was playing tricks on her eyes, making her think she saw lights where there couldn't possibly be any. She tried to maintain her vlogger personality, but her voice had this strained quality, and she kept losing her train of thought mid-sentence. At exactly 8 p.m., she made her check-in call on the satellite phone, and we could hear her telling her parents everything was fine, that she was having an amazing time. But after she hung up, she sat there staring at the phone for a full minute before whispering to the camera, "I need to move the car." The next video clip started with the camera shaking wildly as she hurried back to her Subaru in the growing darkness. Her breathing was heavy and ragged, and she kept muttering things like, "This isn't right," and "They shouldn't be here." When she reached the car, she fumbled with her keys, dropping them twice in the sand before managing to unlock the door. She threw the camera onto the passenger seat, and for a few seconds all we could see was the ceiling light and her arm reaching for the ignition. The engine turned over but didn't start. She tried again, pumping the gas pedal, and this time it roared to life. But then she just sat there, gripping the steering wheel, and in the dim light from the dashboard, we could see tears streaming down her face. "I can't leave the tent," she said to nobody in particular. "All my stuff is there. They'll know I was here." She wiped her face with her sleeve and grabbed the camera again, and what she said next made Detective Vasquez pause the video to call his supervisor. "If something happens to me," Natalie said, looking directly into the lens. "Carson knew about this place. He kept asking questions about whether I'd be alone, and he marked something on my map that I didn't ask for. I think he sent them here." Detective Vasquez left to make his calls while I continued watching the videos, and what I saw next still gives me nightmares. Natalie had driven her car about a mile from her campsite, parking it behind a large rock formation, then walked back to her tent with just the camera and a flashlight. The footage was jerky and chaotic, her flashlight beam swinging wildly across the desert floor, creating monstrous shadows from every small bush and rock. When she reached her campsite, she stopped dead in her tracks. Her tent was exactly as she'd left it, but there were tire tracks circling it, deep grooves in the sand from what looked like multiple vehicles. She approached slowly, camera held high, and that's when we heard it. Men's voices, at least 3 different ones, coming from somewhere beyond the range of her flashlight. They were speaking in low tones, but one phrase came through clearly. She couldn't have gone far on foot. Natalie immediately switched off her flashlight, and the camera's night vision kicked in, showing her crouched behind her tent in that eerie green glow. She was trying to control her breathing, but small whimpers kept escaping. The voices were getting closer, and we could hear footsteps crunching through the sand, along with the metallic clink of what sounded like tools or weapons. For about 10 minutes, the video showed nothing but darkness and the sound of Natalie's terrified breathing. Occasionally, flashlight beams would sweep across the area above her head, and she'd press herself lower into the sand. Then came a moment that made me physically sick to watch. One of the men walked right past her tent, so close that his boots were visible in the frame for a few seconds. He had a rifle slung over his shoulder and what looked like night vision goggles pushed up on his forehead. "She's got to be around here somewhere," he called out to the others. "Check if she doubled back to the rocks." Another voice, older and gravelly, responded from further away. "Told Carson this was too public. Should have waited until she was further into the restricted zone." They continued searching, their lights crisscrossing the desert. And at one point, 2 of them stood directly in front of her tent, discussing whether to slash it open to check inside. Natalie had buried her face in the sand to muffle her breathing, and the camera caught her whole body trembling violently. They eventually moved away, but not before one of them said something that explained everything. "Radio says the test is still scheduled for midnight. We need to find her and get out before then." What happened next was pure chaos captured in fragments of shaky footage. Natalie tried to crawl away from the campsite on her belly, dragging herself through the sand with the camera clutched in one hand. But about 50 yards out, a spotlight suddenly blazed to life, catching her in its beam. She scrambled to her feet and ran, the camera recording wild glimpses of ground and sky as men shouted behind her. We could hear engines starting and the sound of vehicles pursuing her across the desert. She ran toward what she must have thought was the direction of her hidden car, but in the darkness and panic, she'd gotten turned around. The last coherent video showed her stumbling down into a ravine, losing her footing on the loose sand and tumbling down the slope. The camera flew from her hand and landed several feet away, still recording. In the frame, we could see her lying motionless at the bottom for a few seconds, before she slowly pushed herself up and looked around frantically for the camera. Her face was covered in sand and blood from a cut on her forehead, and her eyes had this wild, desperate look. She grabbed the camera and whispered, "They're herding me toward the test area. They want it to look like an accident." Then she turned it off, and the next file was from her phone, just audio, recorded at 11:43 p.m. The audio file was 4 minutes of pure terror, heavy breathing, stumbling footsteps, and Natalie's voice barely above a whisper, trying to leave a final record. "I found a drainage pipe under the fence," she gasped. "Made it through to the other side, but I think this is the restricted area Carson marked. There's these concrete structures everywhere, old bunkers or something." In the background, we could hear distant shouting and what sounded like helicopters. "They're not following me in here," she continued, her voice shaking. "They're just waiting at the fence line. Why aren't they following?" There was a long pause filled only with her labored breathing, then a sound that made Detective Vasquez and me look at each other in horror. A mechanical voice over loudspeakers echoing across the desert. "Weapons test commencing in T-15 minutes. All personnel clear the target zone immediately." Natalie let out a sob. Oh God. They knew. They knew about the test. They chased me right into it. The last 2 minutes were her running, the phone apparently in her pocket, recording nothing but muffled thuds and her desperate breathing. Then, at exactly 11:47 p.m., The audio cut to static for about 10 seconds before ending completely. That static wasn't from damage. I've analyzed it 100 times. It was electromagnetic interference, the kind you get from a massive electrical discharge. Detective Vasquez returned with 2 federal agents who immediately confiscated all the files and made me sign a stack of non-disclosure agreements. They said Natalie had accidentally entered an active military testing ground, that her death was a tragic accident, and that Carson was just a local guide with no connection to anything sinister. But before they took everything, I'd already made copies. I'm not stupid, and something about this whole thing stank. I did my own digging and found out that Carson disappeared the same night Natalie died, and his truck was found burned out in Mexico a week later. The test that night? Officially, it never happened. There's no record of any weapons test at White Sands on that date. But I found something else. 3 other missing persons cases over the past 5 years, all solo travelers who'd hired local guides, all whose vehicles were found abandoned near restricted areas. The official causes of death when bodies were found were always exposure or dehydration. Natural causes, accidents. I think about Natalie every night, about how prepared she was, how careful, and how none of it mattered because she trusted the wrong person. I keep her last video backed up in places the feds will never find, because someday, when I figure out who's really behind this, the world needs to know what happened to her and the others. They weren't accidents. They were hunted. My Subaru's odometer hit 127,000 miles somewhere between Blythe and the trailhead, and I remember thinking that both the car and I had seen better days. At 37, with divorce papers still fresh enough that I kept reaching for a wedding ring that wasn't there anymore, I'd decided 5 days alone in the Sonoran Desert would either fix me or break me completely. Either option seemed better than another night staring at the ceiling of my empty apartment in Los Angeles. I'd been doing these solo desert hikes since college, back when my knees didn't protest after 10 miles, and a 40-pound pack felt like freedom instead of punishment. That morning in early October, I loaded enough supplies for 5 days and headed toward the Palo Verde Mountains, where forgotten mining roads cut through land that most people only glimpse from Interstate 10. My plan was straightforward. Park at the trailhead, hike deep into the backcountry, and let the silence do whatever it needed to do. 12 miles in by late afternoon, my GPS showed an old service road that probably hadn't seen a maintenance crew since Reagan was president. I found a perfect spot between 2 ridges, a natural depression that offered wind protection while staying high enough to avoid any flash flood channels. Setting up my worn 2-person ultralight tent, I watched the October sun turn everything into shades of gold and rust, even making the decades-old beer cans scattered around look almost artistic. The temperature hovered around 75, with that particular desert heat that evaporates sweat before you realize you're sweating. No cell service out here, no emails, just miles of creosote bushes and the occasional jackrabbit bolting between rocks. I got my camp stove running for some freeze-dried pasta, optimistically labeled Alpine Minestrone, then sat on a flat rock to watch the sun drop toward the horizon. For the first time in months, that knot in my chest started to loosen. Just as the last slice of sun disappeared behind the western ridge, I stood up to grab my headlamp from the tent, and that's when I saw them. Boot prints in the sandy patch about 15 feet from my tent, clear and deep, like someone had been standing there for a while. The tread pattern was distinctive, some kind of military or work boot with deep chevrons, and they led straight toward my tent from the direction of the old service road. But here's what made me stop and stare. There were no prints leading away, just this one set coming toward my camp, and then nothing. I walked a full circle around my tent, checking every possible angle, thinking maybe the wind had obscured the exit tracks or they'd walked out on the rocky sections where prints wouldn't show. The rocks could hide footsteps, sure, but the approach was all soft sand and gravel. And those prints were fresh, maybe an hour or 2 old at most, the edges still sharp and crumbling. I tried to rationalize it while making dinner. telling myself that someone had probably hiked through earlier, maybe another desert rat like me looking for solitude. They saw my tent going up, decided to give me space, and backed out the way they came, stepping in their own tracks. It happens sometimes when you're trying not to disturb other campers, but the more I looked at those prints, the less sense that made. The spacing was wrong for someone walking backward, and the depth was too consistent, like they'd stood in each spot deliberately, watching. By the time I finished eating, full dark had settled over the desert, and I kept my headlamp on longer than necessary, sweeping it across the empty landscape every few minutes. The silence out there was absolute, not even wind through the creosote, just my own breathing and the tick of my camp stove cooling down. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of gravel shifting outside my tent. Not the random scatter of a small animal, but deliberate, rhythmic, like footsteps trying to be quiet. The sound would come in sets of 3 or 4, then stop for maybe 30 seconds, then start again, always from the same direction as those boot prints. I lay there in my sleeping bag, every muscle rigid, listening to what I gradually realized was breathing. Slow, controlled breathing just outside the thin nylon wall of my tent, maybe 3 feet from where my head was. I could hear the slight wheeze at the end of each exhale, like someone with mild asthma, or maybe just winded from hiking. My knife was in my pack's side pocket, but reaching for it meant making noise, and some primal part of my brain insisted that staying perfectly still was the only thing keeping that canvas barrier between us intact. The breathing continued for what felt like hours, but was probably 20 minutes according to the glowing digits on my watch. Sometimes it moved, circling the tent slowly, pausing longest near the zippered entrance. I kept waiting for the zipper to move, for fingers to test the fabric, for something to escalate this beyond just presence. But whoever it was seemed content just to stand there, breathing in that measured way, occasionally shifting their weight on the gravel. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the sounds stopped. No footsteps walking away, no gradual fade into distance, just an abrupt end to the breathing and the gravel sounds. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the noise had been. I lay awake until dawn, my hand wrapped around the knife I'd finally retrieved, listening to nothing and wondering if nothing was actually nothing. First light couldn't come fast enough, and when it finally did, I unzipped my tent with the knife still in my hand, half expecting to find someone standing there. Instead, I found new boot prints, the same chevron pattern, but this time they formed a complete circle around my tent, maybe 6 feet out. The circle was perfect, like whoever made it had used my tent as the center point and walked around it multiple times, layering print over print. But the part that made my throat go dry was where the freshest set ended, right at the foot of my tent, toes pointing directly at where I'd been sleeping. The sand there was compressed differently, 2 deeper impressions like someone had stood in that exact spot for a long time, just watching the tent. I grabbed my phone to take pictures, needing some kind of proof that I wasn't losing it out here, and that's when I noticed something that turned my stomach cold. My phone showed 37 photos I didn't remember taking, all from around 3 in the morning. Every single photo was taken in complete darkness, the flash illuminating portions of desert landscape, and one recurring subject, my tent. The first few were from maybe 50 feet away, showing my little orange shelter glowing in the flash like a beacon. Then they got progressively closer, 20 feet, 10 feet, 5. The last dozen were taken from different angles around that perfect circle I'd found in the sand, each one showing my tent from a slightly different perspective. In one, you could see the shadow of my body through the fabric, curled up in my sleeping bag. The timestamp showed they were all taken within a 15-minute window, right around the time I'd been lying there, listening to those footsteps, gripping my knife. But here's what really got me. In the last photo, taken from right beside the tent entrance, you could see a partial reflection in the tent's rainfly. A face, distorted by the curve of the fabric, but definitely human. Male, I thought, with hollow cheeks and eyes that caught the flash in a way that made them look silver. I should have packed up right then, hiked the 12 miles back to my car, and gotten the hell out of there. That would have been the smart move, the sane move. But something in me, maybe pride or maybe just the stubborn refusal to let some desert creep run me off, made me decide to stay one more night. I spent the day hiking the surrounding area, partly to clear my head, and partly to look for any sign of where this person might be camping. The old service road showed tire tracks from maybe a month ago, nothing recent, and I found no other tents, no fire rings, no trash, nothing to indicate anyone else was out here. Around noon, I climbed to the top of the eastern ridge and scanned the valley with my binoculars. Nothing but empty desert stretching for miles, heat shimmer making the distant mountains dance. I told myself whoever it was had probably moved on, some weirdo with a camera who got his kick scaring solo hikers. By evening, I'd almost convinced myself the second night would be peaceful. I set up a perimeter of sorts, stringing paracord with my bear bell attached between some creosote bushes about 20 feet from my tent. Not exactly high-tech security, but it would at least give me warning if someone approached. I also moved my sleeping position, putting my pack where my head would normally be and lying the opposite direction in my bag. If someone was watching through the fabric again, they'd get the layout wrong. As darkness fell, I kept my headlamp off, sitting outside the tent and letting my eyes adjust to the starlight. The Milky Way stretched overhead, so bright you could read by it, and for a while the beauty of it made me forget why I was sitting there like a guard dog. Around 10, I finally crawled into my tent, keeping my boots on and my knife within easy reach. I lay there listening to the desert sounds, a distant coyote, the rustle of a kangaroo rat, the normal night music that should have been comforting. The bear bell never rang. That's what I keep coming back to, even now. My little alarm system stayed completely silent, but around 2 in the morning, I woke to find my tent glowing faintly from outside. Not the sharp, sudden blast of a flashlight, but a soft, steady illumination, like someone was holding a lantern just far enough away to light up the orange fabric without casting distinct shadows. The light moved slowly, circling the tent counterclockwise, pausing every few feet. I could hear footsteps this time, deliberate and unhurried, and that same wheeze-touched breathing from the night before. But what made every hair on my body stand up was the sound that came next. My own voice, playing from what must have been a phone speaker, saying words I'd spoken earlier that day while hiking. 37 and starting over, my recorded voice said, tinny and distant. Either fix me or break me completely. The recording repeated those phrases over and over, mixed with the sound of my footsteps on gravel, my breathing from the climb up the ridge, even the zip of my tent from that morning. When the light finally stopped moving, it settled right where my head should have been if I hadn't switched positions. The person outside pressed something against the tent fabric, and I heard the distinctive click of a camera shutter, followed by the whir of an instant photo printing. They did this maybe a dozen times, each click followed by that mechanical whir, and I could hear them carefully placing each photo on the ground. The breathing got closer, so close I could smell something through the tent fabric. Sweat, yes, but also something chemical, like darkroom developer fluid. Then, in a voice that sounded like it hadn't been used in days, raw and cracking, they spoke just one word: wrong. The light clicked off and I heard footsteps moving away, not trying to be quiet anymore, just walking straight out into the desert. This time I could track them getting fainter and fainter until they blended into the ambient noise of the night. I didn't move, didn't breathe deeply, didn't even shift position until dawn broke 3 hours later. Outside my tent that morning, arranged in a semicircle where my head should have been, were 12 instant photos. Each one showed my tent from the exact same angle, taken moments apart, creating a kind of stop-motion effect of the fabric moving slightly in the night breeze. But in the center photo, circled in what looked like red grease pencil, was the faint outline of my pack through the tent wall, right where I'd positioned it as a decoy. The word "wrong" was written across the bottom of that photo in the same red pencil, the letters pressed so hard they'd torn through parts of the image. I packed up faster than I'd ever broken camp before, practically running the 12 miles back to the trailhead, my neck cramping from looking behind me every few seconds. My car was untouched, thank God, though I found one more instant photo tucked under the windshield wiper. A picture of me from behind, taken the morning before as I'd hiked away from the parking area, completely unaware I was being followed. I drove straight to the Riverside County Sheriff's Station in Blythe and filed a report showing them all the photos on my phone and the instant pictures I'd gathered up. The deputy who took my statement, an older guy named Hernandez, listened to everything with this expression that got more concerned as I went on. He told me there'd been similar reports over the past 2 years. Always solo hikers, always in that same general area near the Palo Verde Mountains. Nobody had ever been hurt, but several people had cut their trips short after experiences like mine. They'd increased patrols on the service roads, but whoever was doing this knew the desert better than anyone. Probably lived out there full time, moving camp constantly. Hernandez kept the instant photos as evidence and gave me his card, said to call if I remembered anything else. 3 months later, he called me. They'd found an abandoned camp about 5 miles from where I'd been, hidden in a narrow canyon. Dozens of instant photos scattered around, all of different tents, different campers, spanning what looked like years. A collection of recorded sounds on old cassette tapes. Voices, footsteps, tent zippers, camp stoves. But whoever had been living there was gone, leaving only boot prints that ended at the rocks, heading deeper into the desert. They never found him, and as far as I know, they're still looking. I haven't been back to the desert since. The assignment had come through on a Friday afternoon, right when I'd been contemplating whether freelance photography was still paying enough to keep me in 29 Palms. Some boutique travel magazine wanted desert sunrise shots for their spring issue, offering triple my usual rate if I could deliver within the week. My landlord had been calling about February's rent, which meant saying no wasn't really an option. I loaded my Jeep Cherokee that night, checking the weather reports obsessively while packing every lens I owned. Clear skies predicted for the next 4 days. Perfect conditions for what they wanted. The editor had been specific about wanting something different, something that captured the raw isolation of the high desert, away from all the typical tourist spots everyone photographs to death. I left my apartment at 3 in the morning on Saturday, driving out past the main entrance to Joshua Tree and heading toward the northern boundary where hardly anyone ventures. The service roads out there were mostly forgotten, used maybe once or twice a year by maintenance crews checking on old communication towers from the 60s. I'd scouted the area on Google Earth the night before, finding a ridge that would give me an unobstructed view of the sunrise hitting the valley below. The turnoff appeared right where the satellite images said it would be, marked by a rusted yellow gate hanging open and a sign that read, "No maintenance beyond this point" in faded red letters. The road beyond looked rough but manageable, just packed dirt and gravel disappearing into the darkness. I shifted into 4-wheel drive and kept going, figuring the worst that could happen was having to reverse back out if things got too sketchy. About 3 miles in, the road started deteriorating fast. What had been packed dirt turned into loose sand with deep ruts carved by flash floods from who knows how many seasons back. The Cherokee was handling it fine though, and according to my GPS, I only had another mile to reach the spot I'd marked. The headlights kept catching Joshua trees at weird angles, their twisted arms creating shadows that made them look like people frozen mid-dance. I remember thinking how perfect this was going to be for the shoot, how the magazine would eat up shots from a place this remote and untouched. The dashboard clock showed 4:47 when I finally reached the ridge, giving me just enough time to set up before the golden hour started. I could already see the faintest hint of blue on the eastern horizon, that beautiful gradient from black to indigo that only happens in the desert. I pulled off the main track onto what looked like a flat clearing, perfect for parking while I worked. The sand seemed firm enough when I first drove onto it, compacted by wind and occasional rain into something that felt almost like concrete. I grabbed my main camera bag and tripod from the back, leaving the engine running with the headlights on so I could see what I was doing. The spot I wanted was about 50 feet from the car, right at the edge where the ridge dropped off into the valley. Setting up the tripod in the dark while wearing a headlamp always makes me feel like some kind of desert astronomer, adjusting legs and checking levels while the rest of the world sleeps. After getting everything positioned, I realized I needed my wide-angle lens instead of the telephoto I'd mounted, so I jogged back to the Cherokee to grab it from my second bag. That's when I noticed the Cherokee had shifted. Not much, maybe 6 inches backward from where I'd parked it, but enough that the front wheels had settled deeper into what I now realized was much softer sand than it appeared. The headlights were angled slightly upward instead of straight ahead. I threw the car into reverse to back it onto firmer ground, just a quick adjustment, maybe 3 feet at most. The wheels spun freely, that high-pitched whine that every desert driver knows means trouble. I tried rocking it forward and back, gentle on the gas, keeping the wheel straight. The Cherokee sank another few inches. The sand under the front tires had turned into powder, the kind that flows like water once you break through the crusty surface. I turned off the engine and sat there for a minute, my headlamp beam catching the dust particles still floating from my attempt to move. No cell signal, obviously. I knew that coming in. But I had water, food, and the weather was mild for early February. Someone would come looking if I didn't deliver the photos by Monday. I tried digging out the front wheels with my hands first, then with a collapsible shovel I kept in the emergency kit. The more I dug, the more sand flowed back in, like trying to make a hole in a bucket of flour. The sun was starting to rise behind me, painting the valley in shades of orange and pink that would have been absolutely perfect for the assignment. I actually took a few shots while I was thinking, muscle memory taking over even while my brain worked through the problem. By full daylight around 7:30, I'd accepted that I wasn't getting the Cherokee out on my own. The temperature was already climbing, probably hitting 70 degrees, and I could see heat shimmer starting to form on the distant mountains. I decided to record a video message on my phone around noon, when the heat was making me dizzy despite drinking water constantly. Just a quick thing to send to my roommate Wendy once I found signal, explaining where I was and that I needed someone with a truck and tow rope. I propped the phone against a rock and sat in the shade of the Cherokee, trying to look casual rather than desperate. "Hey Wendy, really stupid situation here," I started, managing a laugh that sounded forced even to me. "Remember that assignment I mentioned? Well, I'm stuck out on a service road north of Joshua Tree, about 4 miles from Highway 62, past a yellow gate with a no-maintenance sign. I gave her the GPS coordinates from my camera, described the Cherokee's position, told her to bring Keith and his F-150. The video ran for maybe 2 minutes before the phone screen went black. Dead battery. I'd been using it as a backup GPS all morning, and the heat had drained what little charge remained. The charger cable was in the Cherokee, but the car battery had died an hour earlier from my attempts to rocket free. The wind started picking up around 3 that afternoon. Nothing major at first, just enough to blow sand into my eyes whenever I stood up. I took shelter in the Cherokee, doors closed, watching the Joshua trees bend and sway through the dusty windshield. Then I saw something that made me sit up straight. Way off in the distance, maybe half a mile down the service road, a dust cloud was moving toward me, not the random swirls from the wind, but a focused column like a vehicle would make. I grabbed my camera with the telephoto lens, using it like binoculars to get a better look. Through the viewfinder, I could just make out what looked like a dark-colored truck, moving slow but steady up the road. Relief flooded through me so hard I actually laughed out loud. Someone else had decided to brave the service road, probably another photographer chasing the same remote beauty that had lured me here. I stepped out of the Cherokee, waving both arms above my head, already rehearsing my embarrassed explanation and grateful thanks for the rescue. The truck stopped about 300 yards away. Just stopped, engine still running from what I could tell by the exhaust shimmer, but not moving any closer. I kept waving, even jumped up and down a few times, figuring maybe they couldn't see me clearly through the blowing sand. The vehicle sat there for what must have been 5 minutes, though it felt like an hour. Then slowly, it started backing up, reversing down the exact path it had come. I screamed at them to wait, actually screamed until my throat went raw, but the sound got swallowed by the wind. Through the camera lens, I watched the truck disappear back into the desert haze, that dust column gradually fading until there was nothing left but empty road and my own disbelief. My brain kept trying to rationalize it. Maybe they thought I was dangerous. Maybe they were lost themselves. Maybe they didn't even see me. But something about how deliberately they'd stopped, waited, and then reversed made my chest tighten with a fear I couldn't name. The wind got serious as the sun started dropping toward the horizon. Not a dust storm exactly, but what locals call a blow, where the sand gets picked up in sheets and visibility drops to maybe 100 feet. I huddled in the Cherokee, feeling it rock with each gust, sand hissing against the windows like static on a dead TV channel. That's when I noticed the other set of tire tracks. Fresh ones, maybe a few hours old at most, running parallel to the service road about 20 feet away. They weren't from the truck I'd just seen. These were wider, deeper, like from something heavier. The tracks went about 50 yards past my position before curving sharply back toward the road and disappearing. Someone else had been here recently, close enough to see my stuck vehicle but hadn't stopped or left any sign. I took photos of the tracks with my camera, switching to manual focus because the autofocus couldn't handle the blowing sand. In the last shot, just as the memory card filled up, I caught something else. Headlights in the distance, multiple sets this time, arranged in a pattern that didn't make sense for normal traffic. Night fell hard and fast once the sun dropped behind the mountains. The wind had died down to occasional gusts, but the darkness out there was absolute, the kind where you can't see your hand in front of your face. I turned on the Cherokee's interior light briefly to organize my water bottles, trying to ration what I had left for however long this would take. That's when I heard the engines, not one vehicle but several, circling somewhere out in the darkness beyond where I could see. They'd drive close enough that I could hear the crunch of tires on sand, then pull away again, over and over like some kind of game. I stayed frozen in the driver's seat, interior light off now, barely breathing. The sound patterns weren't random. They were coordinated, like they were taking turns approaching from different angles. At one point, high beams flooded the Cherokee's interior so bright I had to shield my eyes, staying on for maybe 30 seconds before cutting out completely. Then silence. Complete, total silence that stretched on for hours until I started to wonder if I'd imagined the whole thing. Dawn came gray and hazy through a thick coat of dust on the windshield. The Cherokee was half buried, sand piled up to the bottom of the doors on the windward side. I forced the door open and stumbled out, my legs cramped from sitting rigid all night. The desert looked different, reformed by the wind into new patterns and small dunes. All the tire tracks from the night before were gone, erased like they'd never existed. My water was down to half a bottle, my lips cracked and bleeding despite the chapstick I'd been applying obsessively. I made the decision to leave the Cherokee and walk back to the main road, taking just my camera and the remaining water. But when I tried to orient myself, nothing looked familiar. The service road I'd driven in on was completely obscured, covered by fresh sand with no trace of the path. Even the distant mountains looked wrong, like I was seeing them from a different angle. That's when I understood with perfect, terrible clarity that whoever had been circling in the darkness hadn't been playing a game. They'd been waiting for the storm to do its work, waiting for the desert to erase everything, waiting for me to make exactly this choice. I started walking anyway, using the sun to head roughly east toward where Highway 62 should be. Every few hundred yards, I'd stop and scan the horizon with my camera's telephoto, looking for any sign of the road or power lines or anything human-made. About an hour in, I spotted vehicles again, 2 pickup trucks parked on a rise maybe a quarter mile to my south, just sitting there with what looked like people standing beside them, watching me through binoculars. When I changed direction to walk toward them, they got back in their trucks and drove away, maintaining that same quarter-mile distance. When I stopped, they stopped. When I moved, they moved. Like they were hurting me, keeping me walking in a specific direction. The heat was brutal by mid-morning, probably pushing 95 degrees, and my water was gone. I tried doubling back toward the Cherokee, but every time I turned around, one of the trucks would swing wide to block that direction, forcing me to keep going east into increasingly rough terrain. By noon, I couldn't walk anymore. I found a small overhang in a rock formation and collapsed in its shade, my camera still hanging around my neck out of pure habit. The trucks had disappeared again, but I knew they were out there, waiting. I managed to turn the camera on one last time, scrolling through the photos I'd taken, the sunrise shots that had brought me here, the tire tracks in the sand, and that final image of the approaching headlights. I deleted everything else to save battery and recorded one more video, whispering because my throat was too dry to speak normally, explaining everything that had happened, describing the trucks, the deliberate way they'd trapped me. The camera died halfway through a sentence. That's when I heard a helicopter in the distance and started laughing, thinking I was hallucinating. But it was real, a sheriff's department chopper that had spotted the Cherokee's roof still visible above the sand. They found me unconscious about 200 yards from the rock formation. Apparently, I'd tried to signal them and collapsed. The rescue team said they'd been searching since Monday when the magazine called asking about the photos. The sheriff's department never found any evidence of the trucks I described. No tire tracks, no sign of other vehicles in the area for weeks, according to them. They suggested dehydration and heat exhaustion had caused hallucinations, which apparently happens a lot in rescue situations. Maybe they were right, but when they returned my camera from the Cherokee, that last photo was still there on the memory card, the one with multiple headlights approaching in formation through the dust. The sheriff's deputy who looked at it said it was probably just lens flare from the setting sun, combined with blowing sand, nothing unusual for desert photography. He seemed pretty convinced, even showed me similar effects in other desert photos online. I didn't tell him about the video I'd recorded on the camera, the one that should have been there but wasn't, like it had never existed. I didn't mention that the timestamp on that last photo showed 11:47 p.m., hours after sunset, when there was no sun to create lens flare. I just thanked them for saving my life, collected my insurance payout for the buried Cherokee, and moved to Portland 2 weeks later. I still do photography, but only urban stuff now, buildings, people, city life. Sometimes editors ask if I'd consider taking desert assignments again, offering good money for that isolated beauty everyone wants to capture. I always politely decline. Whatever was out there circling in the darkness that night, whether it was real or something my stressed mind created, I have no interest in meeting it again. My 14-year-old daughter Amber spotted it first, pressing her face against the dusty window of our SUV and pointing at something orange flickering between the creosote bushes. We were 2 hours into the dirt roads outside Furnace Creek, searching for a camping spot away from the crowds when she started tugging at my shoulder from the back seat. Her younger brother Max was asleep with his head against her arm, drooling slightly, exhausted from waking up at 4 in the morning for this trip. I'd been teaching 8th grade biology in Bakersfield for almost 2 decades, planning this Death Valley expedition since winter break, convincing my wife Lisa that we could handle 3 days of primitive camping with the kids. She'd finally agreed, taking time off from her pharmacy job, though she kept checking her phone for signal every few minutes, worried about being completely disconnected. What Amber had seen made me slow the vehicle to a stop, squinting through the afternoon glare at a half-collapsed tent about 50 yards from the road. Orange fabric whipped in the wind like a flag of surrender. One side completely caved in while the other 3 poles still stood at awkward angles. A ring of stones marked where someone had built a fire, the charred wood inside arranged in a perfect teepee formation that had long since burned out. But the strangest part was what sat beside it. A pile of clothing folded with military precision, each piece stacked on top of the other, as if someone had carefully organized their entire wardrobe before walking away. Lisa noticed them too, leaning forward between the seats. her voice dropping to barely above a whisper as she asked why anyone would leave their clothes arranged like that in the middle of nowhere. Against Lisa's protests, I decided we should report it to a ranger, just in case someone needed help or had gotten lost out here. Max woke up when I turned off the engine, rubbing his eyes and immediately asking for water, while Amber was already unbuckling her seatbelt, eager to investigate. I told them both to stay in the car with the air conditioning running while I walked over to check things out. The ground between us and the abandoned camp was nothing but loose gravel and scattered Joshua trees, their twisted arms reaching toward a cloudless sky. As I got closer, I could see more details. The tent was a decent brand, probably expensive when it was new, with reinforced corners and heavy-duty zippers. The clothes were all men's, different sizes of shirts and pants, even socks rolled into perfect balls, and strangest of all, a pair of hiking boots placed neatly at the end of the pile with the laces tucked inside. I took photos with my phone, making sure to capture everything from multiple angles, then jogged back to the SUV where my family waited. Lisa had that look on her face, the one she got when she had to tell relatives bad news at the pharmacy, all tight lips and worried eyes. We drove another mile down the road before finding our intended camping spot, a flat area protected by a cluster of large boulders that would block the worst of the afternoon sun. While Lisa and the kids started setting up our tent, I tried calling the ranger station, but of course there was no signal. We had a satellite emergency beacon for real emergencies, but this didn't quite seem to warrant that level of response. I made a mental note of the GPS coordinates and figured we'd report it when we drove back toward the visitor center for our Day 2 supply run. That first night passed peacefully enough, though I kept waking up every few hours, listening to the desert sounds outside our tent. Coyotes called to each other across the valley, their yips echoing off the canyon walls, and once I heard something large walking through our camp, probably a bighorn sheep based on the hoof sounds on the rocks. Lisa slept fitfully beside me, mumbling in her sleep about work, while the kids were dead to the world in their sleeping bags. Around 5 in the morning, just as the sky started turning purple at the edges, I gave up on sleep and crawled out to start the camp stove for coffee. The abandoned tent was still visible in the distance, a dark shape against the lighter sand, and I noticed buzzards had started circling above it, 3 of them making lazy loops in the warming air. After breakfast, we decided to hike to a small peak about 2 miles from camp, following an old mining trail I'd read about online. The kids complained for the first half hour, Max dragging his feet and asking every 5 minutes if we could turn back. But once we started finding old rusted equipment from the 1800s, they perked up considerably. Amber found a purple glass bottle half buried in the sand, probably from some patent medicine, and Max discovered what looked like part of an ore cart wheel. Lisa stayed close to me, holding my hand whenever the trail narrowed, still uneasy about the abandoned camp we'd found. We reached the summit around noon, the temperature already climbing toward triple digits, and ate lunch while looking out over the valley spread below us like a brown ocean frozen in time. That's when we saw the ranger's truck, a white speck moving along the road far below, stopping exactly where we'd seen the abandoned tent. The hike back down took longer than expected because Max had started developing blisters, and we had to stop every few hundred yards to adjust the moleskin on his heels. By the time we reached our camp, around 3 in the afternoon, the heat had become oppressive, turning the air into a shimmering curtain that made everything in the distance wobble like a mirage. The kids immediately retreated into the tent to play cards, while Lisa and I sat in our folding chairs under a tarp we'd strung between the SUV and a large boulder. We were sharing a warm beer, the last one from our cooler that had any pretense of being cold, when we heard a vehicle approaching. A Park Service truck pulled up beside our SUV, and a ranger stepped out, a tall woman with sun-damaged skin and wraparound sunglasses that reflected our camp like tiny mirrors. She introduced herself as Ranger Colton and asked if we'd seen anything unusual in the area. I told her about the abandoned camp we'd spotted yesterday, even showed her the photos on my phone, zooming in on the folded clothes and the collapsed tent. She studied each image carefully, her expression never changing. then handed my phone back and said something that made my chest tighten. That camp had been cleared 6 months ago, she said, after a 3-week search and rescue operation for a geology professor from UC Davis and 2 graduate students who'd gone missing. They'd found the tent exactly as I'd photographed it. Clothes folded the same way, but no bodies. No tracks leading away. Nothing to indicate where the 3 men had gone. The area had been thoroughly searched with dogs, helicopters, even thermal imaging drones at night. She said they'd removed everything, documented it all for the investigation, and she'd personally supervised loading the tent and belongings into evidence bags. Yet here I was showing her pictures from yesterday, of the exact same scene, down to the way the socks were rolled and the boots positioned. Ranger Colton asked to see the GPS coordinates on my phone, then radioed someone, speaking in codes I didn't understand before switching to plain English. She wanted backup to check the site again, mentioned something about another occurrence, and told whoever was on the other end to bring the special documentation kit. While she waited for the response, she walked around our camp, examining our setup with an intensity that made me uncomfortable, taking photos of our tent, our vehicle, even our camping chairs arranged around the dead fire pit. Lisa came out of the tent where she'd been checking on the kids, and I could see her pharmacy training kick in as she read the ranger's body language, the way she positioned herself between Colton and the tent entrance. The ranger noticed and forced a professional smile, telling us we should consider moving to the developed campground near Stovepipe Wells, that this area had been having some issues lately that they were investigating. We might have taken her advice if the kids hadn't been so tired and cranky from the heat, and if packing up didn't mean another 2 hours of driving on rough roads. Lisa and I discussed it quietly, while Ranger Colton walked back to her truck to make more radio calls, and we decided to stay just one more night, leave first thing in the morning. The ranger didn't seem happy about our decision, gave us her direct radio frequency and told us to call immediately if we noticed anything unusual, and I mean anything, she emphasized, even if it seemed minor. After she left, driving back toward where we'd seen the abandoned camp, the afternoon felt heavier somehow, like the desert itself was holding its breath. We made dinner early, nobody talking much, and were all in our sleeping bags by 8 o'clock when the last light faded from the sky. I remember checking my watch at exactly 11:47 p.m. when I heard the first sound that didn't belong, the distinct metallic whisper of a zipper being pulled, slow and deliberate, somewhere very close to our tent. I lay perfectly still, every muscle rigid, listening to that zipper moving tooth by tooth in the darkness outside. Lisa was breathing deeply beside me, and I could hear both kids snoring softly in their bags, none of them aware of what was happening. The zipper stopped, and for maybe 30 seconds there was absolute silence, the kind that makes your ears ring from the absence of sound. Then I heard footsteps, not the random scuff of an animal, but measured, careful steps circling our tent, pausing every few feet like someone was examining our setup. My hand found the flashlight I'd kept beside my pillow, fingers wrapping around the metal cylinder while I tried to control my breathing. The footsteps stopped directly outside the wall where Lisa was sleeping, and I could hear breathing, slow and controlled, inches from the tent fabric. That's when I noticed our tent zipper, the main entrance, was moving, the pull tab sliding upward so slowly I could barely see it in the dim starlight filtering through the mesh window. The zipper had moved about 6 inches when Amber suddenly cried out in her sleep, a sharp "no" that cut through the silence like a gunshot. The movement stopped instantly, and I heard the footsteps retreat quickly, not running but walking fast, controlled, heading away from our camp. I grabbed the flashlight and unzipped the tent in one motion, bursting outside with the beams sweeping across the desert, catching nothing but empty sand and the shadows of Joshua trees. Our tent had been cut, a clean diagonal slash through the rainfly about 3 feet long, edges so straight it looked like someone had used a razor. I woke Lisa, whispered what had happened while she pulled the kids close, their sleepy confusion turning to fear when they saw my face. We packed everything in 20 minutes, throwing gear into the SUV without bothering to fold or organize, and started driving out with our headlights cutting through the darkness. About a mile down the road, my light swept across the spot where the abandoned camp had been, and the tent was gone, the fire ring scattered. But the clothes were still there, now arranged in a perfect circle on the ground with the boots placed dead center, laces tied together in an intricate knot I'd never seen before. We drove straight through the night, nobody sleeping. The kids huddled together in the back seat while Lisa kept checking the mirrors for headlights that never came. When we finally reached the visitor center at dawn, I marched inside to file a report with the first ranger I found, a young guy named Howell who looked like he'd just started his shift. I showed him the photos, told him about Ranger Colton's visit, the tent being cut, everything that had happened. He typed it all into his computer, nodding along, then stopped mid-keystroke when I mentioned Colton's name. He turned his monitor toward me, showing a staff directory, and asked me to point her out. But she wasn't there. No Ranger Colton on the current roster. No tall woman with sun-damaged skin matching her description. Howell made some calls, checked with dispatch about yesterday's patrol schedules, and came back looking puzzled. No ranger had been assigned to that area yesterday, and nobody had reported checking on an abandoned campsite or talking to my family. The investigation that followed turned up nothing concrete, just more questions that nobody could answer. The photos on my phone were real. The slash in our tent was real, but there was no record of Ranger Colton, no evidence of the abandoned camp when a team went back to check, and no explanation for how items from a cleared crime scene had reappeared 6 months later. The Park Service filed it as vandalism and suspicious activity, gave us a case number, and that was that. We never went back to Death Valley, never even talked about camping again as a family. Lisa found a therapist for the kids, told them it was probably just someone playing a cruel prank, maybe some locals who didn't like tourists. But sometimes late at night when I can't sleep, I think about those clothes arranged in that perfect circle, about whoever was breathing outside our tent, and about Ranger Colton, who knew exactly what was happening in that desert but doesn't exist. I still have the photos on my phone, proof that we saw what we saw, but I've stopped showing them to people because the looks they give me are worse than not being believed at all. The trail was supposed to be simple, barely 6 miles total, looping around a stretch of dry land dotted with brittle shrubs and sandstone ridges. I had driven out early that morning, eager to clear my head and take a few photos before the light faded. Hiking alone never bothered me. In fact, it was something I did to disconnect from everything that felt too loud. The plan was to park near the small rest area, follow the path to the ridge, and be back before sunset. The air smelled of dust and something faintly metallic, like a storm that never came. Even then it felt different from any hike I had done before, as if the desert itself was paying attention. I remember the silence more than anything else. It was not peaceful, just heavy, the kind that presses against your ears until you start hearing your own heartbeat. Every step I took kicked up small whirlwinds of pale dust that settled around my boots before vanishing again. My backpack was light, a single bottle of water, my camera, a snack bar, and my phone. The GPS app marked the trail perfectly at first, the little blue dot following the dotted line as expected. Then about halfway through, the signal flickered for a moment, and when it came back, I noticed I had drifted slightly east. I told myself it was fine. The sun was high, and I could always backtrack. By late afternoon, the heat had turned into something oppressive. The light changed in a way that is hard to explain, less golden, more like an old photograph starting to fade at the edges. I decided to cut across a flat area to rejoin the main trail faster, even though it was not part of the marked route. The ground was cracked and uneven, covered in thin white salt crusts that reflected the light almost painfully. I took a few photos out of habit, zooming in on a rusted piece of metal half buried in the dirt. When I looked closer through the lens, I thought I saw movement, just a quick flicker. But when I lowered the camera, the space was empty again. I reached a point where the GPS stopped responding entirely. The signal bar showed nothing, and every direction looked the same. endless pale ground and the shimmer of heat in the distance. I checked my watch, realizing I had only a couple of hours before dark. That was when my fitness tracker buzzed, showing my heart rate climbing even though I was standing still. I laughed nervously, thinking it must be the heat or dehydration, but the beeping kept speeding up. It sounded almost like a countdown, and for a moment I thought I heard something faint in the wind, a soft, rhythmic click, too steady to be random. The air had turned cooler, but the silence grew heavier, thick enough that every breath seemed to echo. I started walking toward a ridge that looked familiar, convinced it would lead me back to the main route. My shadow stretched long and thin, distorted by the uneven ground. That was when I noticed something strange. Faint indentations in the dust ahead, too wide to be animal tracks, but not deep enough to be human footprints. They ran parallel for a few yards, then stopped abruptly as if whoever made them had just vanished mid-step. I crouched to look closer, running my fingers along the edges, but the ground felt unusually smooth, like glass warmed by the sun. When I stood back up, I caught a brief reflection from something about 30 feet away. It was small, metallic, and half buried near a cluster of dry brush. I walked toward it, the sound of gravel crunching under my boots the only thing breaking the stillness. The object turned out to be a weathered radio, old enough that the brand name had faded off. The antenna was missing and the battery cover was sealed shut with dried mud. I turned it over, and as I did, it gave a faint click, so quiet that I thought I imagined it. Then, almost immediately, the air seemed to change temperature, like a wave of cooler air rolling through without any wind to carry it. I remember glancing at my camera, thinking I should record it, not out of fear, but out of a strange sense that I was standing somewhere I was not supposed to be. The lens captured nothing unusual, just dry terrain and the horizon bleeding into pale sky. But the sound in the background caught my attention. It was faint but rhythmic, a pulse-like tapping that came and went in short bursts. I looked around for power lines or loose metal that could be vibrating, but there was nothing. The desert stretched empty in every direction, and I began to notice how unnatural the quiet felt, as though something had swallowed up every sound except my own breathing. When I decided to head back, the GPS on my phone flickered again before dying completely. The battery had been at 70% minutes earlier. I told myself I could find the car by using the sun's position, but the light had shifted oddly, flattening everything around me. Every direction looked the same, just colorless ground and dry shapes that blurred when I stared too long. My heart was racing again, harder this time, and my tracker buzzed once more. I turned off my camera, zipped it in the backpack, and started walking fast. I kept thinking I was retracing my steps, but after a while I realized I was walking toward a place I did not recognize at all. After what felt like an hour of walking, the landscape began to play tricks on my vision. The horizon shimmered, and shapes formed in the heat, distant and uncertain. I could have sworn I saw a fence line ahead, but when I approached, it dissolved into nothing but twisted roots and sand. I called out once just to hear my voice, but the sound didn't carry. It died a few feet away, swallowed by the dry air. The silence was so deep it almost rang in my ears. I remember thinking that if I stood perfectly still, the world might stop noticing me altogether. When I checked my watch again, it showed the same minute it had 20 minutes earlier. The second hand ticked once, then stopped. I tapped the glass, convinced it was stuck, but it didn't move. For a moment I had the strange impression that time itself had thinned somehow, stretching and stuttering like a bad recording. The pulse from the fitness tracker continued, erratic now, flashing red every few seconds. Then came that sound again, the faint metallic click exactly like the one from the radio. It was behind me this time, steady, deliberate, like someone testing a switch on and off. I turned slowly, scanning the empty expanse. Nothing moved, yet I felt the air shift again, cool, then warm, like breathing in and out. My throat was dry enough to ache. I wanted to sit down, but the thought of stopping made me uneasy, as though the ground itself might open if I stayed too still. I kept moving, trying to head west, judging by the fading light. I found myself counting my steps just to keep rhythm, whispering the numbers out loud so I would not forget the sound of my own voice. The landscape had no pattern anymore. I might as well have been walking in circles. Eventually, I spotted what looked like my own footprints leading back toward a low ridge. Relief hit me hard enough that I laughed under my breath. The tracks looked fresh, too clean to have been made hours ago. But when I followed them, they stopped abruptly next to a small clearing, an oval patch of flattened ground surrounded by brush. My backpack was sitting there, zipped perfectly shut, as if I had placed it down carefully and stepped away. My shoes were beside it, side by side, neatly aligned. For a few seconds, I genuinely thought someone was playing a cruel joke. I took a step closer, certain I must have dropped the backpack earlier without realizing it. But the straps were spotless. No dust, no sweat marks, nothing that suggested I had carried it through miles of heat. The shoes were the same way, lined up like they were on display. A shiver ran through me, not from cold but from the strange neatness of it. I reached down to touch the zipper, and the moment my fingers brushed the fabric, I heard that metallic click again, louder this time, right next to my ear. I spun around expecting to see someone, but the space was completely empty. Even the light looked different, dimmer, like twilight had come all at once. I grabbed the camera from the backpack and turned it on, hoping the lens would catch whatever I was missing. The viewfinder showed the same patch of desert I stood in, nothing more. Then, for half a second, a faint distortion crossed the screen, a blur shaped almost like a person standing in the distance. The moment I blinked, it was gone. I hit record anyway, panning slowly around, my breath shallow. Somewhere behind me, that clicking sound repeated, this time spaced out, mechanical, deliberate. It echoed once, twice, then stopped altogether. I remember whispering, "Hello?" and realizing my voice did not echo back. The sun had almost vanished when I finally saw the faint shimmer of my car's windshield far off on the horizon. Relief flooded through me. I stuffed everything into the backpack, slung it over my shoulder, and started walking fast. Each step felt heavier than the last, like I was moving through invisible resistance. When I reached the spot where I thought the trail should reconnect, there was nothing, just unbroken desert. The sky had turned a strange shade of gray-blue, and I could not tell where the horizon ended. That was when the fitness tracker went silent. Its display froze, showing one last number flashing red before the screen went black. The final thing I remember is pressing the record button one more time, lifting the camera toward the empty land. The wind picked up for the first time that day, carrying a faint metallic hum that rose and fell like a signal trying to form words. The last frame I captured showed nothing but the cracked ground and dry brush swaying in rhythm. Then came that sound again, a single, clean click, and everything went dark. I work as a mechanic for a small auto shop just outside of Barstow, the kind of place where the wind never stops carrying sand across the parking lot. That afternoon was supposed to be simple. I had to deliver a replacement part to a client before dark, an alternator for an old pickup sitting on the other side of the desert. My boss had told me to stick to the main route, but there's always that temptation to shave an hour off the drive. When I saw the faded sign pointing toward Amboy Road, I figured it would be fine. The sun was still up, the air dry but bearable, and my truck had been running smooth all week. About halfway through the stretch, the heat began to build in that suffocating way that makes every sound sharper. The dashboard thermometer flickered past 110, and the horizon started to blur into that liquid shimmer you see above asphalt. I turned off the radio, just to listen to the hum of the engine. It had a faint metallic whine, one I hadn't noticed before. When I checked the gauge, the needle was creeping toward the red. I cursed under my breath, eased off the gas, and pulled over on the side of the road. When I lifted the hood, steam burst out like I'd opened an oven door. The radiator hissed and popped. I waited a few minutes, letting the heat roll off in waves before checking the coolant, bone dry. That didn't make sense. I'd checked it that morning. My phone had zero signal, but that didn't surprise me out there. The desert around Amboy Road stretches forever. No buildings, no signs of life except the occasional tumbleweed bouncing by like it had somewhere to be. A few miles ahead, I thought I saw something that looked like a billboard, just a dark rectangle standing out against the pale sand. It gave me a direction at least. I grabbed my water bottle and started walking, figuring I could reach it within half an hour. The air felt heavier with every step, like it was pressing down on my chest. My boots sank into the soft shoulder of the road, and the only sound I could hear was the crunch of gravel underfoot. That's when I noticed something strange. The billboard didn't seem to get any closer, no matter how far I walked. After about 20 minutes of walking, I realized I was sweating through my shirt, even though the sun had started to dip. The billboard looked warped now, like heat was bending its edges. My tongue felt dry, but I didn't want to waste water yet. Every time I stopped, the silence pressed against me. No wind, no insects, just the faint crackle of heat coming off the sand. I thought I heard a low hum somewhere ahead, maybe a generator or power line, but it faded when I turned my head. The horizon shimmered in all directions, and I started to lose any sense of how far I'd gone. When the ground began to slope downward, I realized the terrain wasn't as flat as it looked from the truck. The sand shifted to hard-packed dirt, scattered with sharp stones and metal scraps that looked half-buried. I saw something glinting near my boot and bent down, a rusted canteen, dented and dry. The surface around it had deep cracks, like the earth had been pulled apart and left that way. I started noticing more debris, an old tire rim, a shattered bottle, what might have been the edge of a sign. It hit me that this might have been part of a mining site once. The billboard wasn't real. It took me too long to admit that. As I got closer, the rectangle dissolved into nothing, just light playing tricks through layers of hot air. But beneath it, there was a dark pit, wide and jagged, as if the ground had caved in decades ago. The edges were lined with wooden beams blackened by time. My boots sent loose gravel tumbling into the hollow, and I heard the faint echo bounce back up much longer than I expected. Whatever was down there went deep. Standing on the edge, I felt an odd vibration under my feet. Not enough to be movement, but like the earth was holding its breath. I called out just to break the silence, but my voice came back warped, as if someone else had repeated it from below. For the first time, I wanted to turn back, but I couldn't find the direction I came from. The sun had dropped behind a ridge, and the desert looked identical in every direction. My truck should have been behind me, but all I could see was the faint line of tire marks leading in a half circle. I tried retracing my own steps, following the indentations my boots had left, but they curved in ways that made no sense. They looped and overlapped, like I had been walking in circles without realizing it. The air shimmered again, and for a second, I thought I saw the shape of my truck in the distance, its silver outline rippling on the horizon. I shouted, but the echo came back wrong, thinner this time, stretched out like someone whispering the last syllable of my name. The sound of it made my throat tighten, and I started walking faster, even though my legs felt heavier with each step. The ground around me changed color as the light faded, shades of red, brown, and almost purple blending together. When I glanced back, I couldn't find my own footprints anymore. They seemed to fade as soon as I moved away from them. My water bottle clanked against my leg, still full, but I didn't feel like drinking. My mouth was dry, yet the idea of swallowing anything made my chest tighten. I remember thinking how quiet everything was, how unnatural it felt to be surrounded by so much space and still feel trapped inside it. By the time the last trace of sunlight disappeared, the pit looked different. It wasn't just a hole in the ground anymore. It looked alive somehow. Shadows moved across it, shifting even though there was no wind. I stood there watching, convinced I saw something at the bottom. Small lights flickering like lanterns deep underground. I told myself it was my eyes playing tricks, but a faint rhythm started rising from the pit, steady and low like the thump of machinery far below the surface. I turned away, but the sound didn't stop. I started walking again, this time not caring about direction. My only thought was to get away from that pit. The desert swallowed the light quickly, and soon I was moving under a sky crowded with stars that felt too close, too bright. The sand reflected their glow in a pale shimmer that made the landscape look unreal. At some point, I tripped over something half buried, a steel beam maybe, and when I got up, my truck was there again, same spot, same open hood. The air above it still wavered from heat, even though the night had turned cold. I walked around the truck twice, trying to make sense of it. The hood was still warm, and the keys were right there in the ignition. My footprints led away from it, a single winding trail that curved back in a perfect loop. For a moment I thought maybe I'd imagined the whole thing, that I'd just gotten turned around in the heat and walked in circles until dark. But when I looked back toward the desert, the horizon flickered again, and I swore I saw that same dark shape where the pit had been, pulsing faintly in the distance like a heartbeat. I got inside the truck, locked the doors, and sat there until the first gray light started to rise. My throat burned, but I couldn't bring myself to touch the water bottle on the passenger seat. The silence outside was complete, not even a breeze to move the sand. I tried starting the engine, and it came to life without hesitation, as if nothing had happened. I drove slowly back toward town, following my own tire tracks until the asphalt appeared again. When I finally reached the main road, my hands were trembling on the wheel, though I didn't feel cold or afraid, just hollow, like something had drained out of me. When I made it back to the shop, my boss asked if I'd gotten lost. He said the rescue crew had been called after the client reported I never showed up. They'd found my truck the night before, hood still warm, doors unlocked, but nobody around. According to them, they'd searched until dawn, following my footprints in a huge circle less than a mile wide. I wanted to tell him that couldn't be right, that I'd walked for hours into the desert, but the words wouldn't come out. I just nodded, pretending I didn't remember much after the engine gave out. It has been years since that night, and I still can't explain what happened. Sometimes I drive that route again, staying on the main highway, and I catch myself glancing toward the sand where the mirage should have been. There's nothing there, not even the faint outline of a pit. But once, just before dusk, I thought I saw a shimmer. A rectangle standing still against the horizon. It looked exactly like that billboard I never reached. I didn't stop to check. I just kept driving until I saw the lights of town again. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. The drive from Madison to Milwaukee usually takes about an hour and 20 minutes, but on Thanksgiving night, the empty interstate stretched ahead like a black ribbon under the November moon. My graduation from nursing school in 2008 meant I'd been making this exact trip for over a decade now, always promising Mom I'd text when I got home safe. That night, stomach still full of turkey and green bean casserole, I had the heat cranked up and some true crime podcast playing through the speakers. The host was describing how predators often work in pairs when my headlights caught something moving near the tree line. At first I thought it was just a deer. Wisconsin has millions of them. But then I saw it was smaller, walking weird, favoring one side like it was hurt bad. I pulled over about 30 feet ahead of where I'd seen it, leaving the engine running because something deep in my gut told me to keep the car ready. When I cracked my door open, the dome light illuminated the shoulder, and there it was. This medium-sized dog, maybe 40 pounds, brown and white patches, dragging its back left leg. Poor thing looked like it had been clipped by a car. Not bad enough to be dying, but definitely needing help. The way it whimpered when it tried to walk made my nurse instincts kick in hard. I grabbed the blanket from my back seat, the one I keep for emergencies, thinking I could wrap it up and get it to the emergency vet clinic near my apartment. The dog stayed about 15 feet away, Not running, but not coming closer either. Just standing there, shaking in the cold Wisconsin air. That's when I heard the other car approaching behind me, which wasn't unusual, except it slowed down and stopped maybe 20 feet back. No headlights though, which struck me as strange because the highway was dark as hell that night, just their parking lights glowing amber. I figured maybe they saw my hazards and thought I needed help. Happens all the time on these rural stretches. But then, both doors opened at the exact same time, synchronized like they'd practiced it, and 2 people got out. In my side mirror, I could only make out their shapes against the faint light from their car interior before they shut the doors. One was definitely bigger, broader shoulders, and they both moved with this purposeful walk that made every alarm bell in my head start ringing. "Buster, there you are, buddy," the smaller one called out, voice carrying clear in the still night air. But something about the tone was all wrong, too rehearsed, like reading from a script. The dog didn't react at all, didn't turn its head, didn't wag its tail, nothing. Just kept looking at me with those pain-filled eyes. The bigger one started making kissing sounds, the kind you'd make to call your pet, but he was walking toward my car, not toward the dog. My hand was still on the door handle, half in and half out of the driver's seat, when the smaller one said something that made my whole body go rigid. "Ma'am, could you help us grab him? He doesn't trust strangers, but if you're already out of your car." The dog was between us and them, but neither of them was looking at it. They were both looking at me. Every self-defense class I'd ever taken, every warning my dad had drilled into me since I was 16, it all crystallized in that moment. I yanked my leg back into the car so fast I knocked my knee against the steering column, slammed the door, and hit the lock button. The bigger one broke into a run the second my door closed, and I mean full sprint, covering the distance to my car in seconds. His fist hit my window hard enough that I thought it might crack, and his face pressed against the glass, mouth moving, saying something I couldn't hear over my own screaming. My transmission was still in park, and my fingers felt thick and clumsy as I fumbled for the gear shift. The smaller one had circled around to the passenger side, trying the handle, then pounding on that window too, and between their bodies blocking my mirrors, I couldn't see anything behind me to reverse safely. The dog just stood there through all of this, hadn't moved an inch despite the chaos, and that detail hit me even through my panic. A real injured dog would have bolted or at least reacted to 2 people running and yelling. I threw the car in drive instead of reverse, flooring it forward, tires squealing on the asphalt. In my rearview mirror, illuminated red by my taillights, I saw them running back to their car, and that's when I noticed they'd left both doors open the whole time, ready for a quick pursuit. My speedometer hit 80 before I even realized it, taking the curves of that dark highway way too fast. But I didn't slow down until I saw the lights of a gas station about 3 miles ahead. My phone was in the cup holder and I grabbed it at a red light, calling 911 with fingers that wouldn't stop trembling. The operator kept me on the line while I pulled into the gas station, parking right in front of the doors where the cameras and lights were. I gave her the mile marker, described the car as best I could. Dark sedan, maybe a Chrysler or Dodge, no front plate that I could see. The 2 people, one about 6 feet, heavy build, wearing what looked like a baseball cap, the other shorter, thinner, both in dark clothes. While I was talking, a highway patrol officer arrived at the gas station, apparently already in the area, and he took my full statement right there in the parking lot. He radioed for another unit to check that stretch of highway, then looked me straight in the eye and said something that made me want to throw up. "You did the right thing driving off." We've had 2 reports this month of a similar setup. Same area, fake injured animal near the forest. What really got me was when he asked about the dog's behavior, nodding when I described how it didn't react to them calling it or to the commotion. "Probably trained for this," he said, explaining that some people teach dogs to limp on command, reward them for staying still no matter what's happening around them. The thought of someone taking what could have been a sweet family pet and turning it into bait for God knows what made me sick. Another officer called in about 20 minutes later, said they'd found fresh tire marks where I'd described but no sign of the car or the dog. They increased patrols in that area for weeks afterward, but as far as I know, they never caught them. The officer gave me his card, told me to call if I remembered anything else or if I felt unsafe, and suggested I vary my routes home for a while. I didn't sleep that night, or the next 3 nights actually, just kept replaying every second in my mind. The way they moved in perfect coordination, how the smaller one's voice had this fake concerned quality, like someone who'd practiced the line too many times. I started researching similar incidents online and found a rabbit hole of forum posts from truckers and late-night drivers across the Midwest. Same pattern in Illinois, Iowa, Minnesota, always rural highways, always between 10 p.m. and 2 a.m., always targeting women driving alone. Some posts described different bait scenarios: a person flagging for help whose partner hides in the ditch, abandoned baby carriers on the shoulder that are empty when you get close, even fake accident scenes. The consensus was that these operations usually involve human trafficking rings, targeting isolated victims on empty stretches where screams won't be heard and witnesses are non-existent. My mom called the next morning, casual as always, asking if I'd gotten home safe like she always did after family dinners. I couldn't bring myself to tell her what happened, just said yes, traffic was light, everything was fine. But I've told pretty much everyone else, especially women who drive alone, because that's the thing that haunts me most. If I hadn't kept my engine running, if I'd walked those extra 15 feet toward that dog, if I'd been just a little more trusting or a little less paranoid, I would have been another missing person case. They would have found my car on the side of the highway, door open, hazards still blinking, and no trace of where I'd gone. My family would have spent the rest of their lives wondering what happened between Madison and Milwaukee on a cold Thanksgiving night. The detective who followed up a week later told me something that explained why they probably chose that specific spot. The forest there connects to a maze of old logging roads, unmapped paths that lead deep into wilderness where nobody goes in winter. Perfect for moving vehicles unseen, for transferring victims, for making people disappear. He also mentioned that the timing wasn't random. Holiday nights when police are dealing with drunk drivers and domestic calls, when response times to rural areas are slowest. These people had clearly done their homework, studied patterns, knew exactly when and where to set their trap. The fake limp was probably practiced hundreds of times. The dog conditioned with treats and praise until it could hold that injured pose no matter what chaos erupted around it. I still drive that route to visit my parents, though now I take the longer way through town after dark, adding 20 minutes but buying peace of mind. Sometimes I wonder about that dog, whether it was stolen from someone's yard, purchased from a sketchy breeder, or raised from birth for this specific purpose. I wonder if those two people are still out there, maybe in another state now, setting up on some other dark highway with their well-trained decoy. But mostly I think about the women who might have stopped before me, the ones who didn't keep their engines running, who trusted their compassion over their instincts, the ones whose families are still searching, still hoping, still checking their phones for a text that says, "Made it home safe." Denver gets quiet when it snows, and that November night was no exception as I walked Cooper through the empty streets near my apartment. My boots crunched against the fresh powder while Cooper, my golden retriever mix, pulled against his leash, nose buried in every interesting smell along Colfax Avenue. I'd moved into the second-floor unit 6 months earlier, right after signing the divorce papers that officially made me single again at 29. The building was one of those converted Victorians from the 1920s, complete with rattling radiators and floors that announced every footstep, but Cooper and I had made it home. That night started like any other. I'd gotten back from my warehouse shift around 9, found Cooper doing his desperate bathroom dance by the door, and bundled up for our usual evening routine. The temperature had dropped below freezing, and thick snowflakes drifted down steadily, muffling the few sounds of passing cars and turning Denver into something from a snow globe. We made our way past the dumpsters behind the building, Cooper taking his time despite my constant shivering, and I remember noticing how untouched everything looked, like nature had thrown a white blanket over the whole neighborhood. After Cooper finished marking his usual spots, we circled back to the front entrance, passing the old fire escape that clung to the side of our building like a skeleton. Snow had accumulated on every step and platform, creating perfect, undisturbed layers that must have been building up for hours. Something caught my eye as I glanced up at my living room window on the second floor. The curtains I always kept closed were parted slightly in the middle, creating a narrow gap where warm light spilled out into the darkness. Strange, I thought, but figured the old radiator must have kicked on and created enough air movement to shift the fabric. Cooper raced up the interior stairwell ahead of me, leaving wet paw prints on the threadbare carpet, while I trudged behind him, feeling every hour of my shift in my lower back. As we approached apartment 2B, I could hear my TV through the door, but something was different about the sound. I distinctly remembered leaving it on ESPN for the Lakers game, but now I was hearing what sounded like a weather report, that droning meteorologist voice talking about storm systems and weekend forecasts. I unlocked the door and Cooper burst inside, immediately heading for his water bowl in the kitchen while I stood in the doorway, staring at the TV. The local news was on, showing some reporter standing in the snow downtown. But I knew for certain I'd been watching basketball before we left. The remote sat on the coffee table exactly where I'd left it, and for a second I wondered if maybe the cable had glitched or the game had ended early. I kicked off my wet boots, hung Cooper's leash on the hook, and walked over to grab the remote, switching back to ESPN where the game was still going, fourth quarter with 5 minutes left. My apartment wasn't much, just a basic one-bedroom with a living room that opened to a tiny kitchen. But I'd gotten used to every sound it made, every way the floorboards creaked, and something felt different that night. The air seemed warmer than it should have been, like the heat had been running longer than the 20 minutes we'd been gone. And there was this smell I couldn't quite place, something like wet wool mixed with stale cigarette smoke. Cooper had finished drinking and was now sniffing around near the coat closet by the front door, his tail low and his body tense in that way dogs get when they sense something wrong. I walked over to pull him away, figuring maybe a mouse had gotten in through the walls again when I heard it. A cough. Not loud, kind of muffled and quick, like someone trying to hold it in, and it came from inside the closet. Every muscle in my body locked up, that primitive freeze response when your brain realizes danger before you fully process what's happening. Cooper started growling, this low rumble I'd never heard from him before, his fur standing up along his spine as he faced the closet door. The blood was pounding so hard in my ears I could barely think straight, but I managed to grab Cooper's collar and slowly back toward my bedroom, trying to remember if I'd left my phone in there, or if it was still in my jacket pocket. The closet door was one of those old accordion-style ones that never quite closed right, and through the gap at the bottom, I could see the shadow of feet. Work boots, from what I could tell, sized way bigger than mine, with snow still melting off them, creating small puddles on my hardwood floor. My brain went into this weird overdrive mode, simultaneously screaming at me to run, while also cataloging stupid details like how those puddles were going to warp the wood if they sat there too long. Cooper's growling got louder, more aggressive, and whoever was in that closet shifted their weight, making the door rattle slightly on its track. I kept backing up, pulling Cooper with me, when my hip hit the corner of the kitchen counter and knocked over the ceramic bowl where I kept my keys, sending it crashing to the floor. The sound was like a gunshot in the tense silence, and immediately I heard movement from the closet, fast and deliberate, like someone preparing to come out. Without thinking, I yanked Cooper into my bedroom and slammed the door, turning the pathetic little push-button lock that wouldn't stop anyone determined to get in. My hands were trembling so bad I could barely pull my phone from my jacket pocket, nearly dropping it twice before managing to dial 911. While the phone rang, I pressed my ear against the bedroom door and heard heavy footsteps moving through my apartment, not trying to be quiet anymore, just walking around like they owned the place. The dispatcher answered, and I whispered as clearly as I could that someone had broken into my apartment and was still there, giving my address on Colfax Avenue twice because I was so panicked I wasn't sure if I was making sense. She told me units were on the way, to stay where I was, stay on the line. But all I could focus on was the sound of my kitchen drawers being opened, the metallic sliding noise they made, and knowing exactly which drawer held my kitchen knives. The footsteps moved from the kitchen toward the hallway that led to my bedroom, slow and deliberate, and I could hear this raspy breathing that wasn't mine or Cooper's. I grabbed the baseball bat I kept beside my bed, a leftover from my softball league days, and positioned myself between Cooper and the door, trying to control my own breathing so I could hear better. The dispatcher kept asking me questions, but I could barely process them. Just kept whispering that he was getting closer. Please hurry. He's right outside my door now. Then the footsteps stopped, and for maybe 10 seconds that felt like hours. There was complete silence except for Cooper's low, continuous growl, and my heart hammering against my ribs. The doorknob rattled just once, a testing kind of turn to see if it was locked, and then I heard him laugh. This quiet, raspy chuckle that made my whole body go cold. Not angry or frustrated, just amused, like this was all some kind of game to him. I heard him walk back down the hallway, and then came sounds I'll never forget. My couch cushions being moved, papers rustling, drawers opening and closing in my living room desk. He was searching for something, or maybe just going through my things because he could, because he'd been in my space while I was gone, and now felt entitled to it. The dispatcher said police were 3 minutes out, but 3 minutes feels like a lifetime when there's only a thin door and a useless lock between you and someone who broke into your home. Through the bedroom window, I could see the snow still falling steadily, the fire escape outside covered in white, just like I'd seen it from the ground, except now I realized those perfect, undisturbed layers I'd noticed earlier had been a lie. He must have brushed the snow back into place after climbing up, covering his tracks, which meant he'd put thought into this, planned it, watched me leave with Cooper before making his move. Suddenly I heard sirens in the distance getting louder, and the sounds from my living room stopped immediately. Fast footsteps crossed my apartment, and I heard my front door slam open so hard it hit the wall. I stayed frozen in place, bat still raised, Cooper pressed against my legs, listening to those heavy boots running down the interior stairs. The dispatcher was saying something, but I couldn't focus on her words. Just waited until the sirens were right outside my building before I finally unlocked my bedroom door with shaking fingers. My apartment looked like a tornado had gone through it. Every drawer pulled out, cushions thrown around, papers scattered across the floor. The closet door hung open, and inside I could see where he'd pushed aside my coats to hide, the hangers still swaying slightly. There were wet boot prints everywhere, leading from the window to the closet, then throughout my apartment, and finally out the front door that still stood wide open. 2 cops showed up first, both younger guys who seemed almost as nervous as I was, followed by an older detective who took one look at the scene and immediately called for the crime scene unit. They found where he'd jimmied my living room window from the fire escape, the lock completely broken, wood splintered around the frame. The detective, a woman named Reeves who had this calming way of talking, explained that there'd been a string of similar break-ins in the neighborhood, always during snowstorms when footprints would be covered quickly, always targeting second-floor apartments with fire escape access. What made me different, she said, was that I'd come home while he was still there. The others had been out for hours, returning to find their places ransacked. They collected fingerprints from the window frame and closet door, took photos of the boot prints before they dried completely, and had me walk through to see if anything was missing. My laptop was still there, my TV, even the cash I'd left on my dresser, which made everything worse somehow, knowing he wasn't after my things but something else, maybe just the thrill of being in someone else's space. Detective Reeves found something I hadn't noticed in my panic, a half-eaten sandwich on my kitchen counter, made with my bread, my turkey, my mustard, with a bite taken out of it like he'd been having a casual lunch. Next to it was an open beer from my fridge, mostly empty, condensation still beading on the bottle. The violation of it hit me harder than the ransacked drawers. This person had made themselves at home, eaten my food, drank my beer, probably sat on my couch and watched my TV while I was walking Cooper in the snow. She bagged everything for evidence and mentioned they'd found similar scenes at other break-ins. The intruder always helping himself to food, always leaving that signature half-eaten meal behind like some kind of calling card. Cooper hadn't left my side since the police arrived, pressing against my legs whenever anyone moved too suddenly, and I knew he'd sensed the danger before I had, tried to warn me with his body language that something was wrong with that closet. They caught him 5 days later, trying the same thing 3 blocks away at another Victorian conversion. The homeowner had installed a security camera after hearing about the break-ins, and it caught him clear as day, climbing the fire escape during another snowstorm. Gregory Watts was his name, 43 years old, had been living in his car since getting evicted 6 months earlier. Detective Reeves called to tell me they'd found items from all the break-ins in his car, including a notebook where he'd written down addresses, schedules, details about the residents. My entry was there. 2B Colfax, single male, dog, walks 9:30 p.m. most nights, works late shift. He'd been watching us for weeks, learning our routine, waiting for the perfect snowy night. The court gave him 18 months and I got a victim notification letter saying he'd be eligible for parole in 9. I moved out the next month, found a place on the ground floor with better locks and no fire escape, though Cooper and I still do our evening walks. But even now, whenever it snows, whenever I come back to find something slightly out of place, a curtain shifted, or a cushion moved, I think about that cough from the closet and check every door, every window, every hiding spot before I can breathe normally again. The week after Halloween always feels strange in our neighborhood, like the whole street is recovering from a sugar hangover, and that Monday in 2018 was no different. I'd just gotten my daughter Chloe to bed around 8:30, which was a miracle considering she was still wired from all the leftover candy I'd stupidly let her have after dinner. Being 33 with a 6-year-old meant most of my evenings looked exactly like this one. Kitchen cleanup, lunch prep for tomorrow, and if I was lucky, maybe 45 minutes of whatever show I was binging before passing out on the couch. We lived in this little ranch-style house just outside Jefferson City. Nothing fancy, but it had a good school district and a big backyard where Chloe could play. The divorce had been finalized that spring, and honestly, those first few months of just the two of us had been harder than I'd expected. But by November, we'd found our rhythm. Around 9:30, right as I was folding the last of Chloe's school uniforms, the doorbell rang. Now, nobody ever came to our door that late on a Monday, especially not in early November when it got dark by 6 and the temperature dropped into the 40s. Through the peephole, I could see 2 figures in dark hoodies standing on my porch, both probably teenagers from their height and build, though I couldn't make out their faces with the hoods up. They were whispering to each other and giggling, that nervous kind of laugh kids do when they're pulling a prank. I figured they were doing some late trick-or-treating dare, or maybe had lost a bet with their friends. Without opening the door, I flicked the porch light on and off twice, my universal signal for nobody's buying what you're selling, and watched through the side window as they looked at each other, laughed harder, then jogged down my driveway and disappeared into the darkness of the street. I went back to the laundry, but something kept nagging at me about the whole thing. Maybe it was how they'd stood there. Not quite right. Like when you see someone in a play trying too hard to act natural. The taller one had kept his head tilted down the entire time, and the shorter one's giggle had this weird rhythm to it, almost mechanical, like he was forcing it out at regular intervals. But I brushed it off because, honestly, teenagers are weird, and after teaching 3rd grade for 5 years before having Chloe, I'd seen kids do stranger things for attention. I made myself a cup of chamomile tea, checked that the front door was locked, twice actually, and settled into the living room with my laptop to finish some lesson plans for my online tutoring students. 10 minutes later, I heard it. A soft tapping on glass, deliberate and spaced out perfectly. Tap, 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 pause, tap, 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 pause. The sound was coming from the back of the house, from the sliding glass door that opened onto our deck. My whole body went rigid in that awful way where you want to move but can't quite get your muscles to cooperate. The tapping continued, patient and steady, and I could picture someone standing out there in the darkness of my backyard, knuckles against the glass, waiting. The motion sensor light back there had been broken since September. I'd been meaning to fix it but kept putting it off, so whoever was out there was doing this in complete darkness. I grabbed my phone and crept toward the kitchen, staying low, keeping away from the direct line of sight to that glass door. From where I crouched behind the kitchen island, I could barely make out a shape through the glass door, just a dark silhouette against the slightly lighter darkness of the yard beyond. It wasn't moving, just standing there, one arm raised like it was about to knock again. The figure seemed taller than I remembered either of those kids being, but maybe it was just the angle, or maybe one was standing on my deck furniture. I dialed 911 but didn't hit call yet. What would I even say? That someone knocked on my door and now they're in my backyard. The tapping started again, but this time it was different, lower on the door, like whoever was out there had knelt down or bent over. Then I heard something that made my chest tighten. The subtle rattle of the door handle being tested, gentle at first, then a bit more insistent when it didn't budge. My phone screen lit up my face in the darkness, and I swear the silhouette outside shifted, like it had noticed the glow. I held my breath and watched as the shape moved sideways along the glass, disappearing from view, and for maybe 20 seconds, there was nothing, just the hum of the refrigerator and my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Then came a scraping sound from the other side of the house, metal on wood, and I realized with horrible clarity what was happening. They were checking the windows. The scraping moved from the guest bedroom window to the bathroom, getting closer to Chloe's room. That broke my paralysis completely. I hit call on 911 and stood up, not caring anymore if they saw me because nobody was getting near my daughter's window, not while I was conscious and breathing. The dispatcher answered on the second ring, and I whispered as clearly as I could that someone was trying to break into my house, gave her my address, and told her my 6-year-old was asleep in her room. She kept me on the line, saying units were on their way, maybe 5 minutes out, and to stay away from windows and doors. But I was already moving down the hallway toward Chloe's room, phone pressed to my ear, when I heard something that stopped me cold. Laughter from outside her window, that same mechanical giggling from earlier, but now it was accompanied by a second voice, deeper, definitely adult, muttering something I couldn't make out. Through the thin curtains of Chloe's room, I could see the shadows of 2 figures right outside, and one of them was doing something to the window screen, pulling at the corner where it met the frame. I burst into Chloe's room and scooped her up while she was still half asleep, blanket and all, and carried her into my bedroom closet on the opposite side of the house. She mumbled something about a bad dream, and I whispered that we were playing a hiding game, that she needed to be super quiet like when we play hide and seek. My beautiful, trusting daughter just nodded against my shoulder and closed her eyes again. The dispatcher was still talking, but I could barely focus on her words because now I could hear them at the front door again. Not knocking this time, but doing something to the lock. A metallic scratching sound that went on for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 seconds. Then suddenly silence. Complete, total silence. Even the dispatcher seemed to sense it because she stopped asking questions and just said, "Officers are 2 minutes out. Stay where you are." We sat in that closet, Chloe breathing softly against my neck, me trying not to hyperventilate, surrounded by the smell of my winter coats and old shoes. Then I heard something that to this day makes me nauseous when I think about it. Footsteps on the roof. Slow, careful footsteps directly above us, moving from the edge toward the center of the house. Our attic access was in the hallway ceiling, just a simple pull-down panel with a folding ladder, and I'd never even thought to check if it locked from the inside. The footsteps stopped right about where that panel would be, and I heard a creaking sound, the kind old wood makes when weight shifts on it. The dispatcher must have heard my breathing change because she whispered that officers were pulling onto my street now, 30 seconds away. The sirens came before the footsteps could move again, and immediately the sounds on the roof turned into scrambling, running, like squirrels but heavier, moving fast toward the back of the house. I heard a thump that must have been someone jumping down, maybe onto the deck, and then nothing. The dispatcher told me to stay put until the officers cleared the scene, and I held Chloe tighter, feeling her little heartbeat against mine. When the police finally gave the all clear and I carried Chloe back to her bed, she was completely asleep, unaware of how close we'd come to something terrible. The officers found footprints in the flower bed below her window. The screen had been cut with what looked like a box cutter, and there were scratch marks on the front door lock, like someone had tried to pick it with amateur tools. But here's the part that still keeps me up at night. The reason I'm sharing this story now, years later, after we've moved to a different state entirely. The next morning, one of the officers came back with a detective, and they asked to see my security camera footage. I'd forgotten about the camera completely. My ex had installed this cheap wireless one by the front door the previous year, and honestly, I rarely checked it. We pulled up the app on my phone and scrolled back to the night before, and what we saw made the detective immediately call for additional units. The first person at my door, the shorter one I'd thought was a teenager, was wearing what looked like a rubber Halloween mask, one of those old man ones with wrinkled skin and wispy gray hair. But it was the taller figure that made everyone in the room go quiet. It was definitely an adult man, probably in his 40s, wearing a teenager's face mask, the kind that just covers the front of your face with elastic bands. The video showed him pulling something from his pocket while the other one rang the doorbell. It was a roll of duct tape. The detective told me they'd been tracking similar attempts in 3 other neighborhoods around Jefferson City that week, always targeting single mothers, always using the same method of sending the masked decoy to the front while the man tried to find another way in. They caught them 2 days later trying the same thing at a house in Fulton, about 20 miles away. The man turned out to be a registered sex offender from Arkansas who'd been violating his parole, and his accomplice was his 19-year-old nephew who he'd convinced to help him. When they searched the man's van, they found zip ties, tape, rope, and a journal with addresses and notes about the routines of different women and their children. My address was in there, along with notes about what time I usually turned off the lights when I left for work, and that I had a young daughter who went to Riverside Elementary. They'd been watching us for at least 2 weeks before that night. I testified at the trial, and he got 25 years. We moved the following summer, and even now, whenever someone knocks on my door after dark, even when I'm expecting them, I check every window and door twice before I go to bed. November always felt heavy in our town, like the air itself was tired from holding up all that gray sky. I'd just turned 17 that September, same week I got my learner's permit, and everything about that fall felt like waiting for something to start. My best friends Garrett and Jenna lived on the same cul-de-sac as me, had since we were in elementary school, and we did everything together. That Saturday night, first weekend of November, the Andersons down on Birchwood were throwing their annual post-Halloween bonfire, the one where everyone brought their leftover candy, and Mr. Anderson told the same ghost stories he'd been telling since we were kids. We went every year, mostly for the tradition now, watching the younger kids jump at the scary parts while we roasted marshmallows and talked about college applications. The fire was dying down around 11 when we decided to walk home, taking the long way through the neighborhood, because none of us wanted the night to end yet. The streets were empty except for a few porch lights and the occasional jack-o'-lantern still glowing on someone's steps, most of them already soft and caving in on themselves. Garrett was doing his terrible impression of Mr. Anderson's voice, making Jenna laugh so hard she had to stop walking, and I remember thinking how perfect everything felt, how these were the moments I'd miss next year when we were all at different schools. We were about 4 blocks from the bonfire when I noticed the van for the first time, this dingy white panel van with rust eating through the wheel wells, crawling along behind us maybe 50 feet back. The weird thing was how it would slow down every time we passed under a streetlight, like the driver was trying to get a better look at us, then speed up slightly in the dark patches between. Garrett was still goofing around, hadn't noticed anything, but Jenna caught my eye and I could tell she'd seen it too, the way her shoulders got tight and she moved a little closer to us. Tried to keep my voice casual when I suggested we cut through the park, thinking maybe the van was just heading the same direction by coincidence. But when we turned onto Sycamore, the van turned too, keeping that same creepy distance. The engine made this low, rumbling sound, not quite healthy, like something was loose under the hood, and I could hear it getting louder and softer as the driver played with the gas pedal. Jenna grabbed my arm then, her fingers digging in through my jacket, and whispered that we should call someone. But who were we going to call? Our parents would freak out, maybe ground us for walking home so late, and we weren't even sure if anything was really wrong yet. The van had tinted windows in the back, completely dark, and the front windshield reflected the streetlights in a way that made it impossible to see who was driving. Garrett finally caught on that something was happening, stopped his joking mid-sentence when he turned and saw the van rolling along behind us. No headlights on now, just these dim orange running lights that made it look like some kind of predator with glowing eyes. We started walking faster without really discussing it, our sneakers scuffing against the sidewalk in this awkward rhythm as we tried not to run but couldn't help speeding up. The van sped up too, engine growling louder, and then did something that made my whole body go rigid with fear. It pulled ahead of us suddenly, maybe 100 feet, and turned into a driveway on the right side of the street, killing all its lights completely. The house it had pulled into was dark, no cars in the driveway except for the van now. And I knew the family that lived there, the Carters, had gone to Florida for a week because their daughter was in my chemistry class, and she'd been complaining about missing the bonfire. The van just sat there in the shadows next to their garage, engine ticking as it cooled, waiting for us to walk past. We stopped dead in the middle of the sidewalk, the three of us breathing hard even though we hadn't been running yet, and I could hear Jenna's teeth chattering even though it wasn't that cold. Garrett suggested we cross the street and go back the way we came, but before we could move, the van's reverse lights flashed on, these harsh white rectangles in the darkness, and it started backing out of the driveway, slow and deliberate. The driver had turned the engine back on but kept the headlights off, and the van was rolling backward down the street toward us, weaving slightly like the driver was watching us in the side mirror instead of looking where they were going. That's when we ran, all three of us at the same time, no discussion needed, just pure instinct taking over. We cut hard left through someone's yard, my foot catching on a garden hose and nearly sending me face first into their lawn gnome collection, Jenna pulling me up by my elbow as we scrambled between two houses. Behind us, I could hear the van's engine roar as it accelerated, tires squealing as it tried to turn around in the narrow street, and then the sound of a car door slamming that sent ice through my veins. We burst into the backyard of a house I didn't recognize, motion sensor floods blazing to life and lighting us up like we were on stage, and Garrett was already pulling out his phone, his hands fumbling with the passcode. The backyard connected to another street through a gap in the fence, and we squeezed through, splinters from the old wood catching on our clothes, ripping Jenna's jacket sleeve. I could taste copper in my mouth from running so hard, and my legs felt disconnected from my body, like they belonged to someone else who just happened to be carrying me along. We were on Oakmont now, at least 6 blocks from where the van had been, and Garrett finally got through to 911, practically shouting our location into the phone while we crouched behind someone's SUV. The operator kept asking him to slow down, to explain what was happening, but how could we explain something that sounded so paranoid when you said it out loud? A van was following us. The driver turned around to chase us. We were hiding now behind a random car, praying the van wouldn't cruise down this street next. The police showed up faster than I expected, 2 cruisers with their lights on but no sirens, and the officers separated us to get our stories while we stood there in the middle of Oakmont, looking like we'd been through a hurricane. My officer, this older guy with a thick gray mustache who introduced himself as Officer Brennan, actually believed us right away, didn't give us any grief about being out late or suggest we were imagining things. He radioed the description of the van to other units, then drove us around the neighborhood in the back of his cruiser, asking us to point out exactly where everything had happened. When we got to the Carter house where the van had pulled in, there were fresh tire marks in the driveway, deep grooves in the gravel where it had reversed hard, and Officer Brennan took photos with his phone, measured the wheelbase with a tape measure from his trunk. He said something into his radio about checking camera footage from the ATM at the bank on Sycamore, which would have captured any vehicle passing that intersection. About an hour later, while we were sitting in the police station waiting for our parents and drinking hot chocolate that tasted like chalk, Officer Brennan came back with this expression on his face that made my chest tighten all over again. They'd found the van, he said, abandoned in the parking lot of Westfield Middle School, still warm, driver's door hanging open. The weird part was what they found inside. 3 rolls of duct tape, a box of zip ties, and a notebook with addresses written in it, including several houses in our neighborhood with the days and times written next to them. The Carter house was on the list with "out of town" written beside it, and there were notes about 3 targets, with descriptions that matched me, Garrett, and Jenna pretty well, down to Jenna's purple backpack and Garrett's varsity jacket. The van had been reported stolen from a plumbing company 2 towns over 3 days earlier, and they never found who'd been driving it that night, despite pulling prints and checking every security camera they could find. Our parents went into full protective mode after that, driving us everywhere for weeks, installing new security systems, organizing neighborhood watch meetings that packed the community center. The detective assigned to our case, a woman named Diane Lawson who wore these thick-rimmed glasses and always had a coffee stain somewhere on her shirt, told us we'd likely been watched for days, maybe weeks, that whoever was in that van had been planning something specific. She showed us footage from the bank ATM that caught the van passing by earlier that evening, before the bonfire even started, just circling the neighborhood in slow loops. You could make out a figure in the driver's seat, baseball cap pulled low, but the quality was too grainy to get any real details. The notebook had our routines written down: when we walked to school, when we stayed after for clubs, when we typically hung out at the park on weekends, and Detective Lawson said we were lucky we'd varied our pattern that night by going to the bonfire. The middle school where they found the van had security cameras too, but whoever ditched it there knew exactly where the blind spots were, parking in the one corner where 3 broken cameras created a perfect dead zone. The only glimpse they got was a figure in dark clothes walking quickly away from the van, heading toward the tree line at the back of the school property. And by the time the K-9 unit arrived, the trail had gone cold at the creek that ran behind the playground. What haunted me most were the small details the detective mentioned almost offhandedly. Fresh scratches on the inside of the van's rear doors, like someone had been testing the locks from inside, and a receipt from a hardware store dated that morning for the zip ties and tape, paid in cash at a store 40 miles away. Whoever it was had driven 40 miles just to buy those supplies where no one would recognize them, then driven back to hunt us. For weeks after that night, every white van made me stop breathing for a second. Every stranger who looked at us a beat too long made my skin prickle with that same fear. Jenna started carrying pepper spray and taking a different route home every day, never the same pattern twice, and Garrett's older brother started picking him up from school in his pickup truck, wouldn't let him walk anywhere alone. The police increased patrols in our neighborhood, and for about a month there was always a cruiser parked near the school, or doing slow loops through our streets. But eventually, things went back to normal, at least on the surface. Detective Lawson called us in December to say they'd connected our case to 2 similar incidents in neighboring counties. Same pattern with the white van and the notebook. But those kids hadn't been as lucky as us, hadn't run fast enough, though she wouldn't give us details about what had happened to them. The case never got solved, at least not while we were still in high school, and by the time I left for college the following year, it had become just another unsolved mystery in the filing cabinets at the police station. Sometimes I Google it, looking for updates or similar cases, wondering if whoever was in that van that night ever got caught somewhere else, but I never find anything definitive. What I can't forget is that moment when the van reversed toward us in the dark, how deliberate it was, How patient they'd been watching us for weeks, learning our habits and waiting for the perfect opportunity. Jenna, Garrett, and I are still close, even though we're spread across different states now. And every November when we text each other around the anniversary, none of us mentions it directly, but we all know what we're really checking on, making sure we're all still okay, still here, still running faster than whatever was chasing us that night. Snow was coming to Plattsburgh that Monday, and I could smell it in the air when I stepped onto my porch with my morning coffee. After 26 years of marriage to Nathan, I'd gotten pretty good at reading warning signs, though apparently not good enough to avoid the October divorce that left me starting over in a duplex that smelled like old wood and whatever the previous tenant had been cooking for the past decade. Frank, my elderly landlord who lived in the other half, had promised quick maintenance response times, which mattered since teaching 7th grade. Math didn't leave me much energy for home repairs. The place had its charm, though, with original hardwood floors and tall windows that actually opened, unlike the sealed disasters in most modern apartments. I'd been there exactly 9 days, still discovering which floorboards creaked and which light switches controlled what. That morning started like the others since I'd moved in, except for the weather forecast promising 6 to 8 inches by nightfall. I stood in my living room, watching the sky turn that sick yellow color that precedes every upstate storm, when I heard this weird scraping noise from below. Real faint, almost like fingernails on concrete, but steady and deliberate. I got down on the floor, pressed my ear against the cold wood, and listened. The sound went on for maybe 10 seconds, paused, then started again. The heating had just kicked on, so I figured it was probably the old pipes doing their thing, or maybe Frank was organizing something in our shared basement. He'd mentioned he kept holiday decorations down there. I finished my coffee, grabbed my stack of ungraded tests, and drove to school through streets that were already emptying out in anticipation of the storm. School let out early at 1:30 because of the weather, and by the time I pulled into my driveway, thick flakes were already coating everything. Frank's car was gone, which wasn't unusual since he mentioned he spent Mondays at his daughter's place in Malone, about an hour west. I brought in an armload of firewood from the covered pile out back, thinking I'd grade papers by the fireplace and enjoy my first real snow day in the new place. But when I walked through the front door, I noticed something immediately wrong. My living room rug, this cheap burgundy thing I'd bought at Target the previous week, was pushed up at one corner, like someone had tripped over it. I specifically remembered straightening it that morning after catching my toe on the edge, and there was this smell, really subtle but definitely there, like unwashed clothes mixed with something else I couldn't identify. The scraping sound started again while I was standing there with my arms full of firewood, and this time it was louder, more insistent. It was definitely coming from directly beneath the living room, right under where I was standing. I dropped the wood on the couch and went to the basement door in the kitchen, flipping on the light switch at the top of the stairs. The single bulb down there barely illuminated anything beyond the wooden steps. I called out, asking if Frank was down there, even though I knew his car was gone. No response, but the scraping stopped immediately, like whatever was making the noise had heard me. I stood there at the top of those stairs for probably a full minute, listening to nothing but my own breathing and the tick of snow hitting the kitchen windows. Every instinct told me not to go down there alone, but I kept thinking about how Frank would react if I called him at his daughter's house over what was probably just a raccoon or some pipes that needed adjusting. I grabbed a flashlight from the junk drawer and made my way down, each step creaking under my weight. The basement was exactly what you'd expect from a house this old. Stone foundation walls, exposed ceiling joists covered in cobwebs, and that damp earth smell that never quite goes away. Frank's half was sectioned off with a piece of plywood, and there were a few cardboard boxes labeled Xmas and Easter stacked against the divider. My side was mostly empty except for the furnace, water heater, and some old shelving units the previous tenant had left behind. I swept the flashlight beam across the floor, looking for any signs of animals or water damage that might explain the noise. That's when I noticed the coal chute door in the far corner, something I hadn't even known existed until that moment. These old houses used to get coal deliveries straight into the basement, and most people just sealed them up decades ago when they converted to gas or oil heat. But this one wasn't sealed anymore. The metal door, maybe 2 feet by 2 feet, was hanging open about 6 inches, and there were fresh scratch marks on the concrete floor leading from it toward the center of the basement. I walked closer, my flashlight beam shaking slightly, and that's when the smell hit me full force. Body odor, stale food, and something sickly sweet like overripe fruit. I pulled the door open wider and aimed my light inside. There was a blue sleeping bag, one of those cheap Coleman ones you can get at any sporting goods store, spread out in the crawl space beyond the chute. Empty Chef Boyardee cans were stacked neatly against one wall, along with water bottles, some still half full. But the thing that made my chest go tight was the phone charger plugged into my outlet, the cord snaking back through the opening to a spot I couldn't see. Someone had been living in my basement, probably had been there before I even moved in, and they were still coming and going through that old coal chute that opened up near the bushes on the side of my house. I backed away from the coal chute so fast I knocked over one of the empty shelving units, the metal crash echoing through the basement. My phone was upstairs, and suddenly that seemed like the stupidest thing in the world, coming down here without it. Turned to run back up the stairs and saw something that made me stop cold. There were footprints in the dust on the concrete floor, fresh ones that weren't mine, leading from the coal chute to the stairs. Not just one set either, but multiple tracks going back and forth, some of them made by bare feet. The most recent ones, still sharp and clear in the dust, went right up to the basement door I'd just come through. This person, whoever they were, had been walking through my kitchen, my living room, probably standing right behind me while I slept on the couch that first week after moving in, too exhausted to make it to my bedroom. I ran up those stairs faster than I'd moved in years, slammed the basement door behind me, and dragged a kitchen chair under the doorknob. My phone was on the counter, and I called 911 with fingers that wouldn't stop trembling. While I waited for the police, I stood at my front window watching the snow pile up, wondering if whoever had been living beneath my floors was out there somewhere, watching me back. The dispatcher stayed on the line, asking me questions I could barely answer because I kept thinking about all those nights I'd heard the house settling. All those mornings I'd found things slightly out of place and blamed my post-divorce brain fog. The woman on the phone kept telling me to stay calm, that officers were on their way. But the snow was coming down harder now, and I knew the roads would slow them down. 20 minutes, she said, maybe 30 with the weather. I moved every piece of furniture I could lift in front of the basement door, creating a barricade that would at least make noise if someone tried to come through. The wait felt like hours, but it was probably only 15 minutes before I heard something that made my whole body go rigid. The scraping sound again, but this time it wasn't coming from below. It was coming from outside, near the living room window, like metal against wood. I crept to the window, staying low, and peeked through the blinds. There was a man out there, skinny and hunched over, wearing a filthy green army jacket that was way too big for him. He had stringy gray hair that hung past his shoulders, and a beard that looked like it hadn't been trimmed in months. He was using something, maybe a screwdriver or a knife, trying to pry open my window from the outside. The snow was coming down so thick I could barely make out his features, but I could see his lips moving like he was talking to himself, and his breath came out in quick white puffs that disappeared into the storm. When he looked up, maybe sensing me watching, his eyes met mine through the gap in the blinds, and they were the palest blue I'd ever seen, almost white, like a husky dog's eyes. He didn't run when he saw me. He just stood there, still gripping whatever tool he'd been using, snow accumulating on his shoulders and in his tangled hair. Then he smiled, not a normal smile, but something that showed too many teeth, yellowed and broken, and he pressed his face right up against the glass. I could see dirt caked under his fingernails as he tapped on the window, 3 soft knocks like he was visiting a friend. The dispatcher was asking what was happening, but I couldn't form words. The man outside tilted his head, studying me like I was something fascinating he'd discovered, and then he spoke loud enough for me to hear through the glass. He said my name, my actual first name, clear as day. Not yelling, not threatening, just conversational, like we were old acquaintances. He knew who I was. He'd probably gone through my mail, my papers, everything I'd thrown away since moving in. He knew my schedule, when I left for work, when I came home. He'd been living underneath me, learning me, and now with the police still minutes away and the snow creating a white wall around my house, he wanted me to know that he knew. I screamed at him to get away, that the police were coming, and that seemed to amuse him because he actually laughed. This wet, rattling sound that I could hear even through the window. Then he held up something in his other hand, and it took me a second to realize what it was. My spare house key, the one I'd hidden under a decorative rock by the back door my second day there. He dangled it between his thumb and finger, making sure I could see it clearly through the falling snow, and then he walked away from the window, disappearing around the corner of the house. The dispatcher was practically yelling at me now, telling me to get to a room with a lock to barricade myself in, but all I could think about was that he had a key, had probably always had it, and every night I'd locked my doors thinking I was safe. He could have walked right in whenever he wanted. I ran to my bedroom, slammed the door, and shoved my dresser in front of it, the wood scraping across the floor just like the sound I'd been hearing from the basement. I could hear him now, the front door opening. Not forced, not broken, just the normal sound of a key turning in a lock and the door swinging open on its hinges. His footsteps were slow and deliberate on the hardwood, and he was humming something, some tune I didn't recognize. The dispatcher said the police were 3 minutes out, maybe less, but I could hear him in my kitchen now, opening drawers, looking for something. Then the footsteps came toward the bedroom, and he knocked on the door, polite as could be, and asked if I wanted to talk about the rent. The rent, like he owned the place, like I was the intruder. He said Frank had promised him he could stay, that they had an arrangement, that I wasn't supposed to be here yet. His voice was calm, reasonable even, which made it so much worse. He said he'd been waiting for the right time to introduce himself, that he didn't mean to scare me, that we could share the space if I wanted. The dresser shook as he tested the door, and I could see the wood starting to splinter near the lock. Then the sirens cut through everything, that beautiful wailing sound getting louder every second. The pressure on my bedroom door stopped immediately, and I heard his footsteps retreat fast across the living room. The front door slammed, and through my bedroom window I watched him sprint through the snow toward the tree line behind the house, that oversized army jacket flapping behind him like wings. The police found me still barricaded in my bedroom, and it took 3 officers to convince me it was safe to move the dresser. They searched the basement, documented everything. The sleeping bag, the food, a notebook filled with observations about my daily routine written in pencil, even sketches of me sleeping on the couch. They found where he'd been getting in and out through the coal chute, the outside opening hidden behind an overgrown juniper bush that Frank apparently hadn't trimmed in years. The man's name was Howard Pelletier, a local who'd been in and out of psychiatric facilities for decades. Frank's nephew recognized him from the description and said Howard used to do odd jobs for Frank years ago, back before his mental health completely deteriorated. They never caught him that night. The snow covered his tracks within an hour, and he knew those woods better than anyone. But they boarded up the coal chute, changed all my locks, and a patrol car sat outside my duplex for the next 3 nights. I moved out the following week, stayed with my sister in Albany until I found a new place, this time a modern apartment on the 3rd floor with proper locks and a security system. Frank tried to keep my security deposit, said I broke the lease, but I had a lawyer friend write him a letter that changed his mind real quick. I heard from another teacher months later that Howard turned up at a homeless shelter in Burlington when the weather got bad in January. The police arrested him there, and he went back to a psychiatric facility, though for how long I never found out. I still teach at the same school, still grade papers in the evening, but now I live in a place where every sound has an explanation, where footsteps belong to neighbors I know by name, and where the only thing under my floor is another apartment with a young couple who play their music too loud on weekends. And that's fine by me. The cold had teeth that November night in Alaska, the kind that bites through 3 layers of clothing and makes your bones ache. I'd been hauling frozen seafood from Anchorage down to Fairbanks for about 6 years by then, enough runs to know every pothole and curve on the park's highway. My rig, a beat-up Peterbilt that had seen better days sometime during the Clinton administration, was parked at a pull-off near mile marker 147, one of those spots truckers use when the official rest areas are full or too far away. The heater was running on low, just enough to keep the frost from forming inside the windshield, and I'd wedged myself into the sleeper cab with my usual setup. Sleeping bag rated for -40, wool socks doubled up, and my phone charging on the little shelf I'd installed myself. Outside, the darkness was absolute, that special kind of black you only get when you're 50 miles from the nearest town, and the clouds are covering whatever stars might be brave enough to shine. I remember checking my watch right before falling asleep, one of those habits you develop when your life revolves around delivery schedules and hours of service regulations. The green digits showed 9:47 p.m., which meant I could get a solid 6 hours before I needed to start rolling again to make my morning drop-off. The last thing I heard was the tick-tick-tick of the engine cooling down, metal contracting in the cold, a sound as familiar to me as my own heartbeat. Sleep came easy that night, the exhaustion of 14 hours on icy roads pulling me under like quicksand. I'd parked here probably 30 times before, always the same spot where the ground was level enough that I wouldn't wake up with a crick in my neck from sleeping at an angle. Other truckers knew about this place too, but tonight I was alone, just my rig and the occasional groan of wind pushing against the trailer. The knocking started at 1:14 a.m. according to that same watch when I jolted awake. 3 measured raps on the driver's side window, not frantic but deliberate, like someone calmly trying to get your attention at a store counter. My first thought was another trucker, maybe somebody who'd blown a tire or needed jumper cables. Happens more than you'd think out here. I sat up in the dark, my breath fogging in the cold air, and fumbled for the little LED flashlight I keep velcroed to the wall. The knocking came again, same pattern. 3 steady knocks that echoed hollow against the glass. Through the sleeper cab's small window, I could barely make out a shape standing beside my door, just a dark outline against the darker night. The person stepped back when they saw me moving, giving me room to climb forward into the driver's seat. When I clicked on the flashlight and aimed it through the window, the beam lit up a man's face that I'll never forget, not because it was scary or deformed or anything like that, but because it was so perfectly ordinary except for one detail. He was sweating. Here was this guy, standing in -20 weather wearing just a flannel shirt and jeans. No coat, no gloves, and there were actual beads of sweat running down his forehead. He had sandy hair cut short, maybe mid-40s, clean-shaven. The kind of face you'd see at any hardware store or gas station and forget 5 minutes later. But that sweat, it was wrong. Like seeing someone sunbathing in a blizzard. He smiled when the light hit him, raised his hand in a little wave, and mouthed something I couldn't hear through the glass. I cracked the window maybe 2 inches, keeping my hand on the gear shift out of habit, ready to fire up the engine if needed. "Hey there, friend," he said, and his voice was steady, casual, like we were meeting at a barbecue instead of a frozen pull-off in the middle of nowhere. "Sorry to wake you, but my car died about a quarter mile back, just around that curve. Battery's fine, engine turns over, but she won't catch. Think it might be the fuel line freezing up. Happens all the time up here, right?" He wiped his forehead with the back of his hand, and I watched the sweat immediately freeze into tiny crystals on his skin. "I was wondering if you could help me push it, get it rolling downhill a bit. Sometimes that's all it takes to get the fuel flowing again. 2 strong guys like us shouldn't take more than 5 minutes." His eyes never left mine the whole time he talked, not blinking much, just steady eye contact that felt rehearsed somehow. The thing about truckers is we help each other out. It's an unwritten rule of the road. I've changed more tires and given more jump starts than I can count, pulled guys out of ditches, shared food when somebody's broke down waiting for a tow. But every instinct I'd developed in 20 years of driving was screaming at me that something was wrong with this picture. Beyond the sweat, beyond the lack of winter clothes, there was the timing. He said his car was a quarter-mile back, but I'd been asleep for over 3 hours and hadn't heard any vehicle pass by. And trust me, you hear everything in a quiet night like that. The gravel crunches, the engine noise carries, especially around curves where people tap their brakes. Plus, if his car really wouldn't start, how was pushing it going to help with a frozen fuel line? That's not how engines work, and anybody who drives in Alaska knows that. "Where's your coat?" I asked through the crack in the window, watching my breath turn to ice crystals in the air between us. The question seemed to catch him off guard for just a second, his smile flickering like a TV losing signal, before coming back full strength. "Left it in the car," he said, laughing a little. "Stupid, I know, but I was so frustrated when she died that I just started walking. Figured I'd find help quick. Been walking for maybe 20 minutes now, worked up quite a sweat actually. Come on, man. I'm freezing out here despite how it looks. My wife's gonna kill me if I don't make it home tonight. Got my daughter's recital tomorrow. She's playing violin, first chair." He pulled out a wallet, started showing me a photo through the window. But in the dark, with just my flashlight, all I could see was the reflection on the plastic sleeve. I kept the window cracked, but didn't move to open the door, and I could see his patience starting to wear thin, though he tried to hide it. His jaw muscles tightened just a bit, and he shifted his weight from foot to foot, not like someone cold, but like someone getting ready for something. "Tell you what," I said, trying to sound helpful. "Let me call you a tow truck. I've got good cell signal here, and there's a 24-hour service out of Cantwell. They could be here in maybe an hour." I reached for my phone, making a show of it, but kept my eyes on him. That's when his whole demeanor changed, like dropping a mask. The friendly smile disappeared, replaced by something flat and calculating. "No need for that," he said, his voice different now, lower, more insistent. "Just need you to step out for 5 minutes. Your truck will be fine, I promise. Just need some help pushing, that's all." That's when I saw it, just a glimpse in my side mirror, movement behind my trailer, maybe 30 feet back. Another person trying to stay in the shadows, moving slowly along the passenger side of my rig. The man at my window must have seen my eyes flick to the mirror because he immediately knocked harder, trying to get my attention back. "Hey, come on, buddy, don't leave me hanging here. Alaska rules, right? We help each other out." His hand went to his pocket, and I didn't wait to see what he was reaching for. I cranked the engine, and the Peterbilt roared to life, diesel smoke billowing black in the cold air. The man jumped back from the door, and in my passenger mirror, I saw the second person sprint away from my truck, heading for the tree line. I slammed the truck into gear and hit the air release, the brakes hissing like angry snakes. The man was shouting something now, but I couldn't hear it over the engine noise, didn't want to hear it. As I pulled out, my headlights swept across the pull-off, and that's when I saw their vehicle, tucked behind a cluster of spruce trees where I hadn't noticed it before. A dark pickup truck with the engine running, exhaust visible in the cold. A third person sitting in the driver's seat. No broken down car, no mechanical trouble, just 3 people who'd been waiting in the dark for someone to stop. I gunned it onto the highway, checking my mirrors constantly for the next 10 miles, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. My CB radio was crackling with static, and with shaking fingers I switched to Channel 19, the trucker's channel, to warn anyone else who might be heading that way. The chatter on the CB that night is what really made everything sink in. About 40 minutes after I'd gotten back on the road, still jumpy at every set of headlights in my mirrors, I heard another driver, handle was Kodiak Bear, talking about something that happened at the Broad Pass rest area, maybe 15 miles from where I'd been parked. A driver had stopped to use the facilities, left his rig running like we all do in winter to keep the diesel from gelling, came back to find 2 men inside his cab. They'd beaten him pretty bad when he tried to stop them, left him on the ground with a concussion and broken ribs while they took off with his truck and $50,000 worth of electronics he'd been hauling to Fairbanks. The state troopers found the truck 6 hours later, abandoned and stripped clean off a logging road. Kodiak Bear said the driver was lucky to be alive, that the temperature had dropped to -30 that night, and if another trucker hadn't found him 20 minutes later, he would have frozen to death right there in that rest area parking lot. I made my delivery in Fairbanks the next morning. Barely slept for the next 3 nights, kept seeing that sweating face at my window every time I closed my eyes. Filed a report with the troopers, described everything I could remember. But they said, without a license plate or better description of the vehicle, there wasn't much they could do. The officer I talked to, a woman who'd been working the highways for 15 years, told me I'd probably saved my own life by trusting my instincts. She said these kinds of setups were getting more common, groups targeting long-haul truckers because we often carry valuable cargo and always have diesel fuel, which sells good on the black market. The sweat on that man's face still bothers me when I think about it, and I finally figured out why he was sweating in that cold. Adrenaline, pure and simple. He was pumped up for violence, ready to do whatever it took to get me out of that cab. Now I sleep with a crowbar next to my bed in the sleeper, and I never crack my window for anyone at night, no matter how legitimate their story sounds. That pull-off at mile marker 147 is still there, but I never stop at it anymore. I'd rather drive an extra hour tired than park in that particular darkness again. The break had been long overdue. Weeks of back-to-back meetings, constant messages, and the kind of exhaustion that makes every day blur together had started to eat away at me. When an ad for a digital detox retreat appeared on my laptop screen late one night, the idea sounded perfect. A quiet lodge tucked somewhere in the Oregon countryside. No screens, no distractions, just time to recharge. The price was low enough to make me wonder if it was some new wellness startup trying to build a reputation, but I booked it anyway. I needed silence more than I needed logic. The drive there took most of a gray November afternoon. The roads grew narrower and lonelier the farther I went, the trees swallowing what little sunlight there was. The sign for Airvale Lodge looked almost handmade, nailed to a crooked wooden post by the side of the road. When I finally pulled into the gravel lot, my phone had no signal. I took it as a good sign, a forced break from everything. The main building looked rustic, a wide porch lined with mismatched rocking chairs, and a carved wooden door that groaned when it opened. A woman in a beige uniform greeted me inside. Her voice was gentle but rehearsed, every word precise. She asked for my name, then reached out her hand and said they'd be holding on to all electronic devices for the duration of the program. Before I could protest, another staff member appeared with a tray lined with numbered envelopes. My phone went into one, sealed with a sticker that read "Serenity requires surrender." They gave me a cotton uniform and a name tag. My own name printed in bold black letters. "Participants blend better that way," the woman said with a kind of warmth that didn't invite questions. Dinner that night felt strange. Everyone wore the same pale clothes, moving quietly around the long wooden tables. No one seemed to know each other, but they acted like they did. Smiling, nodding, serving food in synchronized rhythm. The staff stood along the walls, watching, never eating. When I tried to make small talk with the woman sitting beside me, she simply said, "It's easier if you let go of words." I laughed awkwardly, thinking it was part of the retreat's minimalist philosophy, but something about her expression stayed with me through the night. The next morning began with a bell that rang through the halls at dawn. Everyone lined up in the courtyard like students waiting for roll call. The air smelled like pine and damp soil, and the mist hung low between the trees surrounding the property. A man who introduced himself only as Guy Thomas gave a short speech about releasing digital toxins and rediscovering natural rhythm. His tone was calm, but every sentence carried the kind of certainty that made me uneasy. When I asked how long the program lasted, he smiled without answering. "You will know when it ends," he said, as if it were something obvious. The day unfolded with scheduled silence and strange rituals. We had to walk in single file along forest trails, pause at marked stones, and write affirmations on paper that were later burned in a communal fire pit. Meals were timed to the minute. Every clock in the lodge showed the same hour, even though the sunlight shifted throughout the day. When I asked another participant how long she'd been there, she looked around before whispering. I stopped counting after the third sunrise. Her eyes darted to the nearest staff member. Then she smiled tightly, like she regretted saying it. By the afternoon, the sense of calm that the staff tried to impose had started to crack. I noticed people pacing near the windows or staring too long at the locked gate beyond the main courtyard. I decided to test it myself during a meditation session when everyone's eyes were closed. The gravel path leading to the exit was longer than it looked, and my steps sounded louder than they should have. When I reached the gate, a heavy chain looped through its bars. A padlock the size of my hand hung in the middle. Through the metal, I could see the empty road stretching into the trees. No cars, no signs of movement, only silence so deep it felt staged. That evening, I went to the front desk and asked for my phone. The receptionist, a young man with perfect posture and a voice too calm, checked a list behind the counter. "You signed the agreement," he said, not even looking at me. "You're here until the program ends." I asked again, louder this time, and he repeated the same line word for word as if rehearsed. A couple of staff members appeared behind him, blocking the hallway. Their faces were blank, but their stance wasn't. That was the moment I realized no one here was simply following wellness routines. They were following orders. That night, I barely slept. The lodge walls seemed thinner, the quiet heavier. From my room window, I could see the courtyard dimly lit by lanterns, shadows moving in slow, deliberate patterns. Around midnight, a low hum echoed through the trees, not an engine or generator, but a rhythmic pulse that grew louder every few seconds. When I opened my door to listen, 2 staff members were standing at the end of the hallway, facing me. Neither spoke, but one raised a finger to his lips, motioning for silence. I shut the door and pressed my back against it, heart pounding in my chest. The following morning, the woman I'd spoken to at dinner was gone. Her bed was neatly made, her name tag missing from the wall hook. When I asked one of the cleaners where she'd gone, she replied, she completed her process. That phrase circulated throughout the day like a chant, whispered during meals, murmured by staff, written on the whiteboard in the hall. Completion is peace. By then, I understood that no one here was trying to rest or heal. They were being reshaped into something obedient. I decided to escape that night. During the final group meditation, I hid one of the metal utensils from the dining table under my sleeve. When the lights dimmed, I slipped out through a service corridor that smelled of bleach and wet wood. The kitchen door opened to the back of the property, near the same gate I'd tried before. Using the fork, I wedged the chain loose enough to slip it free of the latch. My fingers were raw, the sound of metal scraping metal slicing through the still air. For a second, I thought I heard footsteps behind me, but I didn't look back. I just ran. The road beyond the gate stretched into the forest. No lights, no signs, just endless darkness. I walked for what felt like hours until a delivery truck appeared in the distance. The driver, an older man with tired eyes, slowed down when he saw me. I told him I'd been hiking and got lost. He didn't ask questions. When I reached the nearest town, I went straight to the police. They said there was no record of a place called Airvale Lodge anywhere in the county, and no retreat registered under that name. I have searched for it online since then, and the website that first drew me in no longer exists. I still have the name tag they gave me. Plain white plastic, my name printed in black letters. Sometimes I catch myself staring at it, trying to remember the faces of the people still inside those walls. I never saw them again, but sometimes late at night, I hear that same low hum from the woods behind my apartment. The coast feels different once the tourists are gone. The air turns sharp, the sand loses its warmth, and the ocean seems louder, as if it is reclaiming the silence. I had taken a last-minute freelance gig, planning to spend a quiet November in a small beach house outside a fishing village in Maine. The owner's photos showed weathered shingles, pale blue shutters, and a wraparound porch that faced the sea. It looked like the kind of place where time slowed down, exactly what I needed to finish a photo series before the snow came. The house itself stood a few miles from town, down a narrow road lined with pines. The front steps creaked under my boots as I carried my gear inside. It smelled faintly of salt and old books, the kind of musty comfort that hinted at years of damp air. The layout was simple. Kitchen and living room downstairs, 2 bedrooms on the main floor, and a staircase that ended at a locked door labeled storage only. The host had mentioned that the upper floor wasn't in use, so I didn't think much about it then. That first day passed quietly. I spent the afternoon walking along the dunes, catching the late sunlight breaking through thick clouds. When night came, the wind began to howl through the cracks in the window frames. The house groaned and shifted with every gust, but there was something peaceful about it. I made tea, edited a few photos, and fell asleep on the couch with the faint hiss of the ocean outside the window. Sometime in the middle of the night, a sound woke me. It was steady and rhythmic, not the wind, not the surf. Footsteps. Light but deliberate, pacing directly above me. I sat up, the couch springs creaking beneath me, and listened. The steps moved slowly from one end of the ceiling to the other, then stopped. My brain tried to rationalize it. Maybe pipes, maybe the house settling, but then a faint tune drifted through the air. Music. Something old, scratchy, like a record playing from another room. I turned off the lamp and held my breath, trying to locate the source of the sound. The melody had a strange quality, a waltz maybe, though the notes seemed warped and distant, like it was being played from behind thick walls. I checked the time. It was close to 3 in the morning. I finally grabbed my flashlight and climbed the stairs. Each step made the old boards groan under my weight. When I reached the door, the music stopped. The silence that followed felt heavier than the dark around me. I tried the handle. It did not budge. Locked. From the inside. I knocked softly, half expecting someone to answer, half hoping no one would. Nothing. My pulse hammered in my ears as I pressed my ear to the wood. Faint shuffling, a drag of movement like someone turning in place. Then, a single thump against the door. I stumbled back, nearly losing my balance on the steps. For a moment, I stood there frozen in disbelief, trying to make sense of what I had just heard. Eventually, I forced myself back downstairs, locked my bedroom door, and waited for daylight. The morning light made everything seem harmless again. I tried to laugh it off, telling myself I had probably been dreaming. Still, curiosity got the better of me. I walked around the outside of the house, camera in hand, tracing the roofline. The upper floor windows were there all right, 3 of them, boarded up, paint peeling away in uneven strips. No lights, no movement. Just the wind rattling the loose boards. I snapped a few photos more out of habit than intention, and went back inside to make coffee. When I messaged the host, I kept it polite. I asked if anyone might have been doing maintenance upstairs, mentioning the music. The reply came quickly. The house doesn't have an upstairs anymore. It was destroyed in a fire years ago. I stared at the screen, rereading it. I could still hear the footsteps in my head, the pattern of them, deliberate and human. I wanted to argue, to ask for proof, but something about the certainty in their message stopped me. Instead, I typed a short thank you and set the phone face down on the counter. That evening, I avoided going near the stairs. I cooked dinner with the radio on just to drown out the creaks of the house. Around midnight, the wind picked up again, carrying the smell of seaweed and smoke through a gap in the window frame. I sat in the living room, scrolling through my camera roll, when something caught my attention. One of the exterior shots I had taken that morning. In the reflection of an upstairs window, behind the warped glass, there was a faint outline of a person. The shape was blurred, but there was no mistaking it. Someone had been standing there, watching. Sleep was impossible after that. I kept the lights on and stayed by the window until dawn. The next morning, I decided to check the attic space from the outside again. The boards over the windows looked undisturbed, but when I touched the edges, flakes of charcoal rubbed off on my fingers. Beneath the wood, the smell of burnt plaster seeped out, faint but distinct. I followed the scent around the back of the house and found a small hatch hidden under the eaves, sealed with rusted nails. It looked like no one had touched it in years. I packed my things that afternoon, told the host I had a family emergency, and left before the sky darkened. As I drove away, I glanced once in the rearview mirror. The upstairs windows were still boarded, but for a moment I could swear one of the boards shifted slightly, just enough for a sliver of darkness to peer through. I didn't stop to look again. I reached the main road and kept driving until the ocean was only a whisper behind me. Weeks later, when I developed the last roll of film, one photo came out that I didn't remember taking. It was the interior of a narrow hallway, wood-paneled, scorched at the edges, and at the far end, a gramophone stood in perfect condition, the needle resting on a spinning record. I still do not know how it appeared among my shots, but I boxed up that film and never touched it again. Sometimes, when the wind is high, I can still hear that same warped waltz playing in my head.